My name is Dennis Speed, and on behalf of Executive Intelligence Review magazine, I would like to welcome you to today's meeting, The Russian Hack Inside Job, Who's Trying to Destroy the Presidency and Start a World War with Russia. That's today's specific topic. Was there a Russian hack, or was there an inside job leak blamed on Russia by another power? We will hear three speakers whose presentations will be different, but each with an essential piece of this story. A story that may determine whether we foolishly stumble into war, including thermonuclear war. We intend to disprove the Russia story entirely, and at least one speaker will contend that there is another foreign power that must be investigated as the possible source for the hoax, in collusion with essentially treasonous elements of the United States, as well as perhaps others. Now, about EIR magazine. We were founded in 1974 by Lyndon LaRouche, an economist, statesman, and philosopher, as well as a lifelong political opponent of the British financial intelligence establishment. Yesterday, despite his lifelong enemies, Mr. LaRouche celebrated his 95th birthday. The EIR has published continuously for 43 years and has distinguished itself by employing a unique investigative method that, while it was not invented by LaRouche, has been brought by him to an extraordinarily high level of refinement as a scientific tool. As a friend of mine, the late Paul Robeson Jr. said to me after meeting Mr. LaRouche in 2008 for about a 4-hour dinner, Lyndon LaRouche is to what economic analysis what Einstein was to physics. I should hasten to add that Mr. LaRouche and Mr. Robeson disagreed on several political areas. This meeting will perhaps be characterized by various differences in political view as well, and we welcome that. When we get to the question and answer period, please keep your questions focused on the essential matters that will be presented, and be mindful that as this is a live webcast, you will want to be concise in your formulations. In other words, don't formulate your question at the microphone. And while you can state the premise of a question, actually ask a question, if you actually have one. This will respect the time and the intention of all of us here today, which is to use truth to knock out the brains of falsehood. Today's speakers also have the distinction of having been targets of criminal prosecution by the United States Justice Department. Some, such as William Binney, have had fraudulent cases against them dropped. Others, like Will Wertz, together with Lyndon LaRouche, were unjustly incarcerated. One of the members, I hope later, of our audience today, former Attorney General Ramsey Clark, who represented Lyndon LaRouche, has said of that case that, quote, it represented a broader range of deliberate cunning and systemic misconduct over a longer period of time, utilizing the power of the federal government than any other prosecution by the US government in my time or to my knowledge. And that is of some relevance to all of us here today, because those kinds of weapons were later used against these gentlemen to my right. Now, we at EIR have contended for 30 years that it was precisely these tactics of the abuse of power, which were being used against many Americans, that forecast what we have found ourselves victimized by as a nation, particularly since September 11th, 2001, until this very moment. Finally, let me simply say on behalf of all of us that we are thinking about the people of Texas, particularly Houston, and of the state of Florida and the Caribbean as they attempt to deal with the forces of nature whose destructive powers were aided by the failure of governments to heed the forecasts of persons such as those on the present panel. The disaster that was 9/11 and the subsequent unnecessary Iraq War, the catastrophe that beset Houston largely as a result of the failure to build infrastructure designed as early as 1940 for that city, and the impending new unacknowledged round of financial collapse about to hit the world's financial system with a force comparable to what is heading toward us out of the Atlantic right now. These are all avoidable, but only by those that have the courage to change their axioms. Now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Will Wertz, Executive Intelligence Review.
Thank you, Dennis. I'd like to start by wishing Lyndon LaRouche happy birthday, which was actually yesterday. As Dennis indicated, it was his 95th birthday. I also want to express my gratitude, the gratitude of the LaRouche movement for the courageous efforts undertaken by Ray McGovern and Bill Binney and the VIPs in the fight for truth. The German poet Friedrich Schiller, in his writing on universal history, said, "What greater gift than truth has any man to give to man?" And what they have developed in terms of the forensics analysis, which they will present later, is extraordinarily important because it undermines the entire lie which has been used to mobilize against Russia, against the presidency of the United States, and against the possibility of a new paradigm for humanity as a whole. Now, many years ago, actually about 2,500 years ago, Plato wrote two dialogues, among others, the Timaeus and the Critias. And what he discusses in both of those is a flood which wiped out an entire civilization. And in Timaeus, what Plato says has a priest say to, reports that a priest said to Solon is, "You Hellenes are never anything but children. There is not an old man among you. There have been and will be again many destructions of mankind arising out of many causes. The greatest have been brought about by the agencies of fire and water." And he points out that the reason that these civilizations were unable to deal with such natural disasters is that the gods' part in them began to wax faint and they began to behave themselves unseemly. They were taking in the infection of wicked coveting and the pride of power. Now, fortunately, we have in the United States some old men, particularly Lyndon LaRouche, who in fact is younger than most people in terms of his mind. But he, I think, is, what I want to do is to lay out exactly what he has fought for in a thumbnail sketch, because I don't have enough time to do this in depth. But Lyndon LaRouche has fought, as Dennis indicated, against the British Empire, stemming back at least to his time in World War II on the Indian subcontinent in Burma, which went by that name at that time, and India. And he saw firsthand the genocidal policy of the British against the Indian population. And he, at that point, developed a lifelong commitment to defeating the British Empire and to do what Franklin Roosevelt told Winston Churchill during the war that he was committed to doing. Roosevelt said, "We are not fighting World War II to preserve the British Empire. After World War II, we are going to use American system methods of economic development to develop the rest of the world." Now, unfortunately, that mission of Roosevelt was sabotaged after his death and by Winston Churchill and by Harry S. Truman, a very small-minded man. And what you had was the first mobilization against Russia, and specifically against the alliance which Roosevelt was committed to, which was an alliance between the United States, Russia, China, and other nations to develop the planet using American system methods. Now, looking at Lyndon LaRouche's fight over a number of decades, I would just point out a few things. First of all, Lyndon LaRouche is an original thinker in the tradition of Nicholas of Cusa, of Gottfried Leibniz. And he's an economist who has correctly forecasted economic developments over any number of decades. He forecasted the economic crisis in the 1968-71 period, which led to Nixon abandoning the Bretton Woods system. And he has put forward solutions over decades, which, if they had been acted upon, would have created a completely different situation on this planet Earth and beyond. In 1975, he called for an international development bank. In 1977, he called for a third national bank of the United States. In the late 1970s and then into the beginning of the Reagan administration, he worked for what Reagan later announced in March of 1983, the Strategic Defense Initiative, as a means of eliminating the danger of thermonuclear war between the United States and Russia in particular. He, in 1983, well, actually 1982, he called for Operation Juarez, which was to be a model for North-South relations between the United States and Mexico, where technology would be transferred to Mexico in exchange for oil, to develop the economy of Mexico. All of the problems that we've had since then surrounding NAFTA and so forth are a result of the failure to economically develop Mexico and also Central America. In 1983, he put forward a program for the long-term economic development of the Pacific and Indian Ocean basins. In 1990, he and his wife, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, put forward the productive triangle, which was a concept of economic development corridors between Paris, Berlin, and Vienna. That was later extended after the fall of the Soviet Union to a call for a Eurasian land bridge. In 1990, he put forward a program which was called the Oasis Plan for economic development in the Middle East, which would have been a basis for solving the Israeli-Palestinian crisis. He, in 1997, called for a new Bretton Woods conference to replace essentially to restore a new financial architecture, as Bill Clinton later called it, before he came under attack. And this would have been the basis for economic development throughout the world. And in 1997, the EIR published a special report, The Eurasian Land Bridge, the New Silk Road. That's 20 years before the development of the One Belt, One Road, Silk Road policy, which is now becoming hegemonic throughout the rest of the world. Now, what I want to address is why there is this attack on Russia, why there is an attack on President Trump. And I would maintain that the main reason is that the British Empire, which does exist, it may exist in a different form than it existed prior to World War II, but it does exist, and it exerts influence throughout the world, and specifically also in the United States. The British have been involved in the attack on Russia and President Trump from the very beginning. It's been documented in the press. There's a Guardian article that appeared that the government communications headquarters of Britain, which is their equivalent of the NSA, as far back as 2015, just after Trump announced for president, began to surveil Trump. That's 2015. And then, of course, you have MI6 in the form of Christopher Steele, who developed the so-called dossier, which has been the roadmap for various intelligence agents in this country who were associated with the Obama administration and Hillary Clinton, who have carried out the continuing campaign against Russia and against President Trump. Now, the basic thing is that they want to stop a situation in which Lyndon LaRouche could actually influence the policies of President Trump as LaRouche influenced the policies and shaped the policies of Reagan in respect to the SDI, and also had the impact of organizing President Clinton to move towards a new financial architecture before he was subjected to an impeachment operation. Now, if you look at President Trump, what did he do? During the campaign, some of the principles were very clear. He wants to work with Russia. It would be a good thing to work with Russia to fight terrorism in particular. He's opposed to regime change policies, which had dominated the United States policies from the Bush administration through Obama, and would have been continued under Hillary Clinton. Additionally, one of the things he did is he sent a delegation to Beijing for the One Belt, One Road conference. And there's at least a potential for President Trump of moving the United States into this new geometry of the One Belt, One Road. Now, in terms of economic policy, and this has not yet been acted on, but he expressed his commitment to the American system of political economy in a way which no other president of the United States has done, at least since Franklin Roosevelt. On October 26, 2016, in Charlotte, North Carolina, he called for a 21st century Glass-Steagall. Then, once president, on March 15, in a speech in Willow Run, Michigan, and then a speech on March 20 in Louisville, Kentucky, and in a speech at the Republican National Congressional Committee on March 21st, he called for the American system of Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, Henry Clay, and Abraham Lincoln. And he specifically said in the last speech, our first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, ran his first campaign for public office in 1832 when he was only 23 years old. He began by imagining the benefits a railroad could bring to his part of Illinois without ever having seen a steam-powered train. He had no idea, and yet he knew what it could be. 30 years later, as president, Lincoln signed the law that built the first transcontinental railroad, uniting our country from ocean to ocean. Now, the Lincoln Transcontinental Railroad was the inspiration for the Trans-Siberian Railroad in Russia. And it was also the inspiration for a much broader grand strategy in the 1890s, which was a precursor to what we're seeing today with the One Belt, One Road policy of the Chinese, which and also advocated by the Russians. And this goes back to a perspective of Gottfried Leibniz, who wrote as follows: I consider it a singular plan of the fates that human cultivation and refinement should today be concentrated, as it were, in the two extremes of our continent, in Europe and in China, which adorns the Orient as Europe does the opposite edge of the earth. Perhaps supreme providence has ordained that such an arrangement, so that as the most cultivated and distant people stretch out their arms to each other, those in between may gradually be brought to a better way of life. I do not think an accident that the Russians, whose vast realm connects Europe with China, and who hold sway over the deep barbarian lands of the north by the shore of the frozen ocean, should be led to the emulation of our ways through the strenuous efforts of their present ruler. And referring to Peter the First. So what you had there from Leibniz is a conception going back into the 1600s of a bridge for humanity between Europe through Russia to China. And that's what we're actually seeing as potential right now, which the British want to stop. Now, I would point out that our enemy has always been the British Empire. We fought a revolution against the British Empire. They burned down the White House in 1812, and they supported the Confederacy in the Civil War. And it was the Russians who effectively supported the American Revolution with the League of Armed Neutrality. And it was the Russians, particularly Tsar Alexander II, who intervened in the Civil War against the British by sending his fleet to San Francisco and New York to prevent any kind of British support for the Confederacy. Now, in the 1890s, there developed an alliance based on the American system of political economy. It involved the French, the Germans, the Russians in particular. And this was the basic idea. Well, let me just say, first of all, Japan. Henry C. Carey, who was an advisor to Abraham Lincoln, sent one of his colleagues, Peshine Smith, to Japan and introduced American system economic policies, which contributed to the Meiji Restoration. In the 1890s, you had an individual, Gabriel Hanato, who was the foreign minister of France. And what he put forward was something he called the Asiatic Grand Central. And this is his description of it. Starting from Orenburg on the river Ural, this railroad would have gone as far as Peshawar on the Indian frontier, joining Russian system to the Anglo-Indian system of railways across Central Asia. It would have been a communication between the Trans-Siberian on the one hand and the Baghdad Railroad on the other, which was being built by Germany from Berlin to Baghdad. The object was to join European railways with the Anglo-Indian railways and beyond with future Chinese railroads. Now, at the same time, you had Count Witte, who in 1892 became effectively the transport minister of Russia, and then later in the year, finance minister. And what he envisioned was the following: a new path and new horizons, not only for Russian, but for world trade. It would rank as, this is the Trans-Siberian Railroad, it would rank as one of those world events that usher in new epochs in the history of nations, and not infrequently bring about the radical upheaval of established economic relations between states, and would, particularly in relation to the Asian nations, provide the basis for recognition of tangible mutual interests in the field of worldwide economic activity of mankind, which is really the conception of President Xi of China, a win-win approach, mutual interests, or the American policy of John Quincy Adams to create a community of interest among a family of sovereign nation states. Now, what happened is that the British moved in to kill this whole perspective. And that's precisely what they're attempting to do now. Specifically, in Germany, Bismarck was forced out in 1890. In 1892, Jules Ferry, who was the mentor of Hanato, was assassinated. Sadi Carnot, the president of France, assassinated June 1894. McKinley assassinated 1901. And Witte was dismissed in 1903. So you had, this is precisely the kind of regime change policy, if you will, which the British and their agents in the United States at this point are attempting against the US presidency in order to prevent this kind of, as Hanato said at that time, Asiatic Grand Central. But now we're talking about a world land bridge. Now, there were additional moves by the British at that point. For instance, on July 16, 1894, the Anglo-Japanese Treaty of Commerce and Navigation was signed, which was to go into force on July 17, basically 5 years later, 1899. But within 2 weeks of the signing of that treaty, August 1st, 1894, you had the launching of the Sino-Japanese 1894-1895 war, which was centered on Korea. And much of the problems that we have today in terms of the Korean Peninsula date back to this whole operation by the British. In 1895, the Japanese seized Taiwan. Then you had this commerce and navigation treaty was further developed in 1902 with the Anglo-Japanese alliance that was signed on January 30. The British also moved forward to create in 1903, 1904, this is after Hanato has been removed from office, the Entente Cordiale between Britain and France. And then you had the Russian Revolution, the first Russian Revolution in 1905, and then you had the Triple Entente involving Russia, Britain, and France in 1907. And of course, with the killing of McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt came to office in the United States, and the close relationship between the United States, Germany, and Russia, which existed under McKinley, was completely reversed, And Teddy Roosevelt went in the direction of a special relationship between the United States and Britain, our enemy. Now, it probably is not insignificant that Teddy Roosevelt's uncle, James Bullock, had been in exile in Britain ever since he was the foreign agent for the Confederacy during the Civil War. And this was a source of Teddy Roosevelt's pro-British policy. Now, so what I'm suggesting here is that you had at that time a direct example of how the British Empire operates. Can I have the first slide? I'll just be very quick about this. That policy was further developed this was in, sorry, I think it was 1928. This is a map, a geopolitical map that was produced by the British geopolitician Harold Mackinder. And the basic idea was that you look at Europe, Africa, Asia, and that's the world island. And the British policy was to surround what they call the pivot area or the heartland, which is Russia, with an inner crescent. And the basic theme of Mackinder was that just a second here, please. Having trouble finding this. Basically, the idea, who rules East Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island commands the world. This was their geopolitical strategy. This is the political strategy which was also developed by Haushofer under Hitler and resulted in the Nazis' attack on Russia, which was supported by the British until Hitler turned west as well. And but if you look at this map, think in terms of the eastward movement of NATO in Europe. Think of the crisis on the Korean Peninsula today. Think of Afghanistan previously and also today. Think of the Arab Spring and the regime change policies carried out by Bush and Obama in Iraq, in Libya, the attempt in Syria, the attempt in Egypt, and so forth. This is the policy which is still being operated on after the fall of the Soviet Union. And it's this policy which must be defeated. And the potential is that President Trump will move against this and will actually work with Russia and China for a revival of this Eurasian land bridge conception. And I think it's just very important that people understand what you have here is a grand strategy which Linda LaRouche has been committed to, his wife Helga Zepp LaRouche is committed to. A grand strategy for humanity as against the oligarchical principle of the British Empire, where peace is where economic development is the basis for peace. It's the basis for cooperation among different nations throughout the world. It's John Quincy Adams' conception of a community of principle among a family of sovereign nation states, where a man can then actually carry out his mission, which is not only to develop the planet for man, but also to explore and colonize space. Going back to the Critias and the Timaeus at the beginning, the point here is man is confronted with floods, he's confronted with fire. In this case, with the hurricanes, there's evidence to suggest that solar activity, fire, is actually involved in the hurricanes and the flooding. There's also but the basic point is that there are acts of omission and acts of commission, which result in a destruction of humanity. The acts of omission include, as previously indicated by Dennis, not building the infrastructure that can actually mitigate hurricanes and so forth. There's an act of omission if you don't work with Russia and China on a joint strategy to prevent asteroids. There's also acts of commission, which include unjust wars, which can result in, which is fire, thermonuclear fire. And there's also acts of commission, including financial policies, which are designed from the standpoint of enforcing zero economic growth and population reduction, which has been the policy of the British Empire. So I'm going to end right now. I think that we have to, as Lyndon LaRouche said, we've got victory is within our reach if we move right now, because we have a different situation than in 1890s, in the beginning of the 1900s. That situation resulted in over 100 years of war, 2 world wars, and then perpetual warfare with short breaks after World War II. Today, we have the potential to actually win. And the basic point is we have to bust out now and seize the moment to put together an alliance, which LaRouche has called the 4 powers: United States, Russia, China, India, to defeat the British Empire. And this will be a liberation of the people of the United Kingdom. It's not aimed at the British people. And in the United States, we have to move with what LaRouche has called the 4 laws, which is the American system, a policy of Glass-Steagall, national banking in the sense of Roosevelt's Reconstruction Finance Corporation, Hamilton's National Bank, to issue credit for economic development. We cannot operate from the standpoint of the miserly conception of we can't spend the money to save people. We spent trillions to save bankrupt banks. We spend trillions to carry out unjust regime change wars. What we need to do is to invest in people, save the people, cancel the British system.
Thank you, Will. Now, our next speaker worked at National Security Agency for over 30 years. And prior to this meeting, I was able to view a documentary I don't think many of you know exists. It's called A Good American. It was actually made over the years 2013 to 2015, was premiered in Europe in 2015, but didn't appear here in the United States until February of this year. And when I asked him why that would be, he said, because they don't want people to know the truth. One of the things that distinguishes him is that in his design of a particular system called Thin Thread, when he was confronted by the concept, which seemed by many to be very daunting, of how do you monitor 2.5 billion electronic units globally in real time, he said, well, if you think about it as being instantaneous, there's only a certain finite number of atoms in the universe at any instantaneous moment. That is, that if you think about things as being finite but unbounded, you can in fact wrap your mind around that problem. The issue which we are confronted with, of course, is wrapping our minds around problems that many of us have ignored. And I want everybody to understand that what you're about to have presented to you by this man, in terms of what he's going to be telling you, is a privileged insight from the inside of how we as a nation have failed to recognize it is our duty to change our axioms to do precisely that. Else we run our nation into a kind of disaster that we can't afford. And so it's my honor to introduce at this point, Mr. Bill Binney.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here. I should tell you a little bit about my background so you can understand where I'm coming from. I basically was one of the main people, or one of several main people at NSA and in the intelligence community doing warning against the Soviet Union. And so I learned very, very clearly that whatever you did or said in relation to warning had to be right. You could not be wrong because this was really a serious issue, right? people could be vaporized as a result. So you had to know and be sure what you were doing. So as a part of that a process, I built up a way of just thinking about how to verify and validate things from multiple sources or from over time, and based on my knowledge of how they operate and the existence of my better understanding of what really meant warning, which the entire intelligence community didn't have. I had 5 warning indicators, which I discussed in a little bit in the movie, but didn't say what they were because I can't. But the point was they were the only 5 meaningful warning indicators, and they had over 100 some on the warning list in the Pentagon. None of the 5 were there. So it basically said people really didn't understand what they were doing. So it was a matter of trying to figure out how can I verify this entire process and be right in what I said to people with backup basic facts that would indicate these are the things they're doing or intending to do. So I was always a factually based person. So in other words, I had to have something to factually ground what I was saying. Otherwise, I didn't say it because it was pure speculation at that point. And anybody's speculation is as good as anybody else's. Emotions can come in, and emotions can change expectations and beliefs and so on. And so you could speculate any way you wanted at that point. It was meaningless. So in other words, I didn't want to waste my mental energy on meaningless activities. So that was the founding principle that I used to verify and validate what I was doing all through the years that I was there. And fortunately so, because I wanted to make sure that the government of the United States didn't have a false statement or a false grounding to make a bad decision, because it could be very serious and bad for the country and bad for the people of the world. So that was my founding. And so when I first heard about this Russiagate and Russia was doing this, I was listening to the news, just like everybody else. And the way they came across saying we have high confidence that this is what they did. Okay, I knew immediately what that meant. That meant they're lying to us. This is called a wild ass guess. Okay, because they fundamentally didn't know. And of course, see, I designed a lot of programs they're currently using to spy on everybody, not intentionally, but they subverted it to do that. Okay, and that's fundamentally what the movie's about. It's about how to design a system to monitor the entire world and pick out. The whole idea was back then, the point was we were facing terrorism, all kinds of criminal activity in the world, and the explosion of digital communications in terms of phones and email and so on. So the question was, how could you design a system to figure out what's going on in the world and pull only that data out that's relevant to the target you want to analyze? And not take in the entire data of the world, because at that point you're buried. And that's fundamentally what they did. So that's why they can't figure out anything now. They're buried. Okay, they think, well, and people like Clapper and others come out and say, I know them personally, by the way, and they come out and say, well, we need to collect more intelligence. Now, collection is intelligence in their mind. All to me, that's only data. That doesn't mean anything. It only when you understand what you've collected can you produce intelligence. It's like I collect books, okay? I build a library. What's in the library? Do I understand? No. I haven't read all the books. So it's like, that's the stupidity of what's going on here. But it costs a lot of money to do this, a lot of money. They've spent almost $1 trillion on intelligence, just intelligence, since 9/11. That's $1 trillion of the 20 that we have now in our debt. So when they said that, I knew immediately this was false. That, the Russians, obviously, they have no idea who did it. But they wanted to create an agenda, and they had an agenda about driving them, and they wanted to create a narrative and manipulate people and give disinformation. And the Russians did the same thing. Every country in the world does the same thing. They call it disinformatia, manipulatia, things like that. Well, every country does that, okay? But coming in and hacking into the DNC, I knew they had no evidence whatsoever. And the question was, can we in the outside, with not having access to all the collection data, can we figure it out? Well, I basically went on television at the time in August of last year saying that this was false, because if it was true, NSA would have it, and they know exactly who did it. And the reason I know that NSA would have it is because of these programs. Can I have my first slide, please? This is the tapping points inside the United States as of 2004. 13 years ago, these were the tap points. Now I know exactly where every tap point is to the building. I don't know what floor in the building, but I know it's this building, okay? I gave these to Laura Poitras with the hope that they would get published, informing the US public where they were being spied from. She gave them to the New York Times. They would not publish. The reason they didn't publish is because they said, well, if somebody attacks one of these sites, then we'll be to blame. So much for informing the US public of what's going on. Okay, so what this really means is, you see, it's distributed with the population of the United States. We are the target. If they were after foreigners, you see the little dots on the corner there, on the little green ones on the coast. That's where the transoceanic cables come up, and that's where all the foreigners are. So if they were going to collect for foreigners, they'd be at those little green dots and nowhere else. So this is one of the first indications. This is where they get it first. The DNC would have been picked up by somebody, one of those tapping points. This is, by the way, AT&T. All the buildings are AT&T buildings. And I did in mathematical terms, I'm a mathematician, you have to excuse me, but I had to do a mapping that said the cluster grouping and cluster mapping of the color code of these tap points with the facilities of AT&T, and they match perfectly. Okay, so so the random probability of that being not somebody else other than AT&T is about 0. Okay, so that meant to me I had the right, this is correct. Okay, and plus the WikiLeaks said it too. So I wanted to prove it, of course, mathematically. So this is just inside the United States. Now, this is the first net that's going to catch anything going out of the DNC or any pedestrian server, or anybody's server inside the United States. This is the first set of tapping points where they'll pick up all this data. Now, these sites have included in them devices like the NARIS device, the Variant device, which are devices that can sessionize the entire 10 gigabit lines, everything on the line. Now, they don't do it that way, of course, because it'd be a waste of sessionizing capacity. What they could do is pipe subsets or sub ports of different fibers into the device, so they get all the emails, all of the file transfers, chatter, things like that, that are fairly easy to manipulate and work with. But some of these have to do with voice over IP and so on. So it's a matter of collecting everything, but taking it all in and then storing it. Now, in order to do that, of course, you need large storage sites. So that's why they built a Utah facility, a 1 million square foot storage facility, because it takes a lot to store all these. You're collecting all this data. I mean, that's what General Alexander, former director of NSA, said when he was in Menwood Hill Station. He said, well, all we have to do is collect it all. Well, if you start with that as the premise, I mean, and our stupid government bought into that. And so that meant that they locked themselves and us into the taxpayers paying for it, the ever increasing amount of money being spent on intelligence to collect everything being said in the world. Well, I mean, that's like locking yourself into an ever increasing budget. That's kind of a good job, if you can get it. I mean, NSA is not audited by the US government. So they're given something like $15 to $16 billion a year to do this, and they've just said, spend it how you need to. We won't ask you how you did it. Well, I'd like to have a job where they can give me $15 billion a year and not ask me how I spent it. But this is how they're wasting our money. And also they're destroying their capacity to do anything, because once you collect all this data, you become totally dysfunctional. Which, when did they stop a terrorist attack? How many have they stopped?
54.
Oh yeah, that's right. He said 54, and he proved, when Senator Leahy said, prove it, he ended up proving 0. That's because they're dysfunctional. And they lie. Of course they lie. I mean, I would go to meetings in NSA Inside Story, and they would say, Congress is coming out here, and we're going to give them a brief on what we're doing here, and this is the story we're going to tell them. So when they come out, Congress gets their staffers come out, and they get their brief, and they ask a few questions about that, and they stick with the story, tell them something, about the story and the storyline, and then they go away. So all they got was the story of the day. So when they needed more money, they changed the story. We need more money. We need, so on, things like that. So they'll change the story. So it's like cybersecurity. If you've noticed the Vault 7 stuff or the NSA shadow group that got some of the NSA hacks, they're all basically the same hacks. It's like hundreds of millions of lines of source code with thousands of different attacks that they knew about all along and never fixed. What that meant was they left everybody vulnerable. And then look what happens. When we get attacked, oh, we need more money for cybersecurity. That I called a swindle. We're being swindled. Well, why don't you fix the problems you already know about? Then maybe we'll have some security. That's the first issue. Then we'll find out how insecure we are, and then we'll give you money to stop it, okay? But they're leaving us vulnerable. Why? Because that allows them to read what we're doing and saying to each other. That's all. It means they can do that with anybody in the world. If you don't fix fundamental problems, they exist everywhere in the world, wherever there's devices, software problems with the operating systems or switches or servers or whatever. All of that is known and vulnerable, and you can read everything everybody's doing. So that means for them on the operations side, that's something they like because they get to see everything. But on the defense side, everybody's vulnerable. And so we get hacked by the Chinese in OPM, where they take out the records of 21 plus million US citizens who have security clearances. That means everybody in FBI, CIA, NSA, and the Department of State. Anybody who has a security clearance in the United States or has ever had one, the Chinese know about. Now, what does that give them? That gives them the advantage of saying, I know, therefore, who's in CIA at every embassy in the world, who's in NSA at every embassy in the world, or consulate. So I know all these people, all their affiliations. I know what they're doing. Okay, then I can deal with them that way, or I can try to recruit them once I know who they are, which is what they do too. So, at any rate, this is just inside the United States. The next slide, please. Around the world, it gets even worse, because out there, there's no distinction whatsoever. They go do anything unilaterally they want to. These are. If you notice down in the lower right-hand corner, the real important one there is the CNE. You see that down there, CNE, greater than 50,000 implants. This is about 5 or 6 years ago anyway, at least. CNE is computer network exploitation. And implants, that means software and or hardware, implants into switches, servers, routers around the world where they control that router and they control that server. So that means anybody sending anything, Chancellor Merkel didn't have to be in Germany to be collected on her cell phone. She could have been in Brazil, for example. And any switch that we had control of down there would pick up her number and route all that, dual route it back to NSA for recording. So you didn't have to be there. This says they own the network. And this is how they monitor. Now they've got hundreds of traceroutes programs embedded in all this stuff. And what traceroute does, it allows them to trace the route of the packets going through the network, the individual packets of a transmission. If your email gets broken down into, say, 20 packets, they can trace the 20 packets and how they got to where they went. So they knew the routing across every segment of the network, the time it took, and all of that. And they could trace it from one point to the other. And embedded in the packet is the originator IP and the ultimate recipient IP. So you can trace everything from end to end. And even if they try to manipulate that internally at different places, you can still follow that through the switches and the servers and the networks and the implants you've got. So I knew that NSA wouldn't say, we've got high confidence. They should say, we know who did it. There's no question. They did that with the Chinese, right? Back a few years ago. Yeah, and there's no reason not to be able to do it in any hacking attempt at all. So, if I were running it, I would have that automated, and that's the way I do things. So it would be automatically alerted, and no one would have to ask. That we'd say, here's who did it, right? And here's when they did it, and all of that. So, but the objective, next slide, is really this is really the ultimate one they have. This is called the Treasure Map program. You can go on the web and read about this if you want. The basic objective is in that little square there. Let's monitor everybody in the world every minute of the day, know where they are. Now, this is unconstitutional. Of course, all this is unconstitutional. That's why when I put it in the sworn affidavit I submitted to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals which is a lawsuit against NSA for their illegal, unconstitutional collection of data on U.S. citizens. I included all these slides as a way of saying I know personally about this stuff and I'm ready to testify. And that's a sworn affidavit. I'm liable for perjury there, okay? And NSA is trying to say, well, he doesn't really know. He's been out of this for 15 years, but the programs they're using are the exact ones I invented for them 15, 25 years ago. And so I know exactly what those programs do and how they interrelate and everything. So I was ready to testify to that, and I still am. So that's why they don't want me in court. So at any rate, so when it came to the Russian allegation that they did that, so we started looking around. I mean, obviously I knew it was false to begin with, and I said that. So, but the question was, can we find some evidence of actually who did it? Well, it took a long time before some evidence came out. It came from Guccifer too, I think. On the 5th of July, he said back then, here's the data, and I took it out on this date. And we looked at that, and we said, gee, here is 1,976 megabytes. Byte is 8 bits a piece. So it's really about 16 gigabits of data. And we took it out, it downloaded it over 87 seconds with like 2 parts, one part initially, a 12-minute dead time, no transmissions, and then another part came out. But overall, just the transmission parts was 87 seconds. So it turned out to be about 23 megabytes per second. So, and that said to me, that's the speed of a download to a USB port to a thumb drive. But that can't go across the worldwide network to Russia because you can't get that speed for that distance. Now, a lot of people, oh yeah, we can do that. And they show it in the lab. It can go in the lab. Sure, you can have a high speed, you can have a gigabit line in the lab. Sure, sort of across there. Yeah, let's try to get it to Russia. Okay. So they kept saying, well, we'll test some more stuff in the lab. And we have a lot of tests going on. We got people testing things still. I mean, we're still looking at it. And people are trying to do it in the lab, find some feasible way to get that rate across. So in the meantime, I thought, well, why do this in the lab? Let's do it in the real world and actually show what happens. So we started testing across the Atlantic to some of my hacker friends in Europe, just to say, why don't you try downloading this file to close to a gigabyte, see how fast you can get it across there. One of our colleagues that helped write the BIPS memo said, well, it's nice to see that the transfer rate across the Atlantic is very similar to the rate at which an iceberg melts. because we were getting it for a 100 megabit personal device at home. We were getting a transfer rate of 0.8 megabytes, which is about 6.4 megabits, right? So, and then for a commercial DSL, we were getting 1.6 megabytes, which is about 1/10 the rate we need. Now we're still testing. We're still going to do that, and we're going to document our testing results. But you can't wait for the government to tell you the truth because they'll never do it. They have an agenda. Their agenda is how can we swindle you out of money? How can we keep the secret state, the shadow government running? And that's part of the point of how they get to get rid of Trump, because Trump he's not a politician, right? He's not from the community of government, and he's a real threat to them. He's already talked about reorganizing the IC, which I volunteered to help him do that. I was one of the ones ready. I would say, okay, what you have to do is say, you're fired, you're fired, you're fired, you're fired. Clean the mess out. Go down at least 5 levels of management, and then you might start to be able to rebuild. Because right now we have an intelligence community that really is a threat to our security and to our livelihood and to our safety, because they're getting us into endless wars. I mean, Hillary Clinton even talked about sending airplanes over there, shoot down the Russian airplanes in Syria. Come on, what do you want to do? Create another world war and let's start firing the missiles? Give me a break. This is the agenda. That's going to cost trillions of dollars. That's what they want to do, create a new Cold War, because that's going to cost trillions of dollars. Another swindle. So the fact that we had to give up privacy to get security was a swindle. That was a lie from the very beginning. We knew how to do that even in 1999, and they rejected it because it didn't cost a lot of money. We developed our entire program from scratch and had it deployed to 3 separate sites running 24 hours a day for $3.2 million. And we were doing selected pulling of data that was relevant, and that was all the data you got. We didn't take in any other data, so everybody had privacy as a result. And any data we took in the metadata, we can encrypt everything. So everything you're looking at encrypted metadata. We actually mathematically we found a way of getting by the homomorphic mapping of encrypted values, which people are stumbling on right now. They
Sounds
can't.
good.
Yeah. Well, there was a little trick to it, but you know.
Do you have any information about 9/11?
Yes. They had all the data to stop 9/11 before 9/11 in their databases and didn't know it. Okay, it was all there. Even the date of the attack was given. Even the date of the attack was given. It was given in a graphic form, you know, like 9/11, 11/9 is the date. Okay, everybody else does day, month, year. We do month, day, year. It's a progression, you know. So, but at any rate, they did a line and a space and a circle and a line. 11/9 as the attack date, as the execution date. So that was given in an email. They had that, but they didn't know it. In fact, I think according to some sources, they actually had somebody in there who was saying the attack was coming, but didn't know the date or anything. And they were trying to report that, but they couldn't, NSA wouldn't let them report it. So, you know, we've never gotten the truth about 9/11 or many other things. And the background and the shadow government and the deep state, the companies that make all the money off all the contracts for all this crap, weapons and intelligence manufactured one way or the other, are behind this. And that's the driving factor. That's what Trump is a threat to. That's why I thought he was the greatest hope that we had to solve this problem, because he was an outsider and he, you know, at least he was a businessman, didn't believe in a lot of BS, in a lot of crap that was wasteful energy. I thought that was hopeful. And since they're attacking him, I'm sure it's hopeful. You know, I mean, they make it obvious that they don't want him, and that's why. So at any rate, if you know, or if you don't, let me. All the network servers, all the people who run the fiber optic lines and communications nets around the world had what they call flow monitors that would also be monitoring all the data flowing across all the lines of the network that they have, so they can load level if there's any problem. They offload to other lines, reroute things, and so on. And so when you looked at this transfer rate of 16 gigabits across the network in like 87 seconds, that would be very much like spotting a pig passing through a python. Can I have the next picture, please? Can you see the pig? Okay, so for a network monitor, he would see this immediately. Okay, you know, this is crazy that nobody would not have noticed this. So we maintained that this was a local download done to a USB port to a thumb drive, and the data was passed that way. And in fact, basically, Guccifer said the same thing when that was his data. And even Cy Hirsch, I think, came out, he was covertly monitored or taped. And he was a bit upset about that, but he actually said he saw FBI report where examining the Seth Rich's computer showed that he was basically contacting WikiLeaks and trying to extort money from them for the data. And so he also said that he had backup, or he had protection, that if anything happened to him, that wouldn't stop the things that are going to happen to them. So that kind of said he's got other people he's collaborating with and sharing this, and it's done locally inside the United States. And somehow he was in the DNC, but other people had access to that, had to be accessed on a high capacity line into the DNC network where they could get to that server and download the data. That's the whole point. That's how fast can you push data across the line? And it will only go as far as you could push it at the rates that are available. And where that kind of comes, it's like a fluid dynamics thing. You know, if you try to run a big pipe into a little one, a big pipe storing data across at only a certain rate, you try to push it into a little pipe, it starts backing up. Well, if it backs up, the system crashes in the network. So he could only take that data as far as it would go at that rate, which means locally. And so we basically said, we don't see how this can be anything but a local download. And we had no evidence from the intelligence community, from anybody else, no specific evidence that we can use to look at to verify that says otherwise. So that's my point. As far as I'm concerned, the intelligence community has been lying to us. Not that we didn't know that. I mean, after all, Clapper would lie to Congress. So would Alexander. I mean, they don't tell you the truth. They have this story du jour. Right? So thanks.
Just like to say, because I know a few people were trying to make sure they got all that, this is all being live streamed, and if you want to have this, we're going to get it out as rapidly as we can, and we hope that you help us get it out as rapidly as you can. And the final speaker is a troublemaker and sort of this generation's answer to Daniel Ellsberg, although I think he's a little better than Daniel Ellsberg personally. And he's going to, well, Ray was with CIA for 27 years, and he's worked, and he's been very important for us getting this story. And of course, his opposition to the Iraq War was a truly heroic act at the time it was done back in 2003 and before that. And we're honored again, of course, to have him speak here too. So Ray.
Thank you. Let me suggest that since we've been sitting for so long, that we take just a half a minute to stand up and stretch a little bit. I know I need to do that. And I know we're on air, so make it quick. And when I say 30 seconds are up, they will be up in 10 seconds. Okay. The abbreviated 30 seconds are up. Now, how many of you have seen A Good American, the film? Okay. All right. Well, well, you're looking at him here, okay? And you may recall our great Attorney General. Actually, he was the presidential legal advisor at the time, Alberto Gonzalez, who said that things like the Geneva Conventions on Prisoners of War were quaint and obsolete. Well, that's what we go by. He's quaint, I'm obsolete. I've got him by 4 years. So meet quaint and meet obsolete. The neat thing is that when we tell the truth, we don't have to remember what we said, you know? Hello, if people would only realize how easy it is just to tell the truth. I guess I'm not understanding completely. Okay, now 2 years ago, and I know this because I'm thinking about this year's award, we are giving the Sam Adams Award for Integrity and Intelligence to Cy Hirsch, okay? We're gonna do that on the 22nd of September in Washington at American University. 2 years ago, we gave it to this fellow, A Good American, okay? And I want to just quote from that citation because it speaks more than just about Bill. Binney represents the patriotic side of a duel between two unequal adversaries, an exceedingly powerful, ruthless state, and Bill, an official who would not break his solemn oath to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, which is the oath we all swear. Now, after 9/11, well, you know how it goes. I'd ask you to complete the sentence. After 9/11, everything changed, right? Okay. Just as in 1933, after the burning of the Reichstag building, everything changed, right? Now, the parallel is eerie. And in our citation, we talked about the Germans reacting with sheepish submissiveness. I got it out right that time. It's really hard. Sheepish submissiveness, okay? As a young German lawyer, this one lawyer said. He wrote in his diary, he said, the Germans had a nervous breakdown. That remind you of something about 9/12? A nervous breakdown, okay? Quote, no one saw anything out of the ordinary in the fact that from now on, one's telephone would be tapped, one's letters opened, and one's test might be broken into. No one saw anything out of the ordinary about that. What was missing, wrote this writer, Sebastian Hafner, was, quote, a solid inner kernel that cannot be shaken by external forces, something noble and steely, a reservoir of pride, principle, and dignity to be drawn on in hour of trial. Now, I'll just quote one more sentence from the citation. We said 2 years ago, these traits were not missing in Bill Binney, nor were they missing in Ed Snowden, whose patriotic risk-taking opened the way for Bill Binney and his colleagues to expose the collected all fanatics and the damage they do to our privacy. Okay, that was great, except we got it wrong. We got it backwards because we had Ed Snowden streamed in and he corrected us. And he said, look, he says, Binney wasn't free after I made my disclosures. What Ed says was, he opened the way for us. And what Ed said in very elliptical words were, without Bill Binney, there would be no Ed Snowden. Whoa, we didn't even know that. In other words, we screwed up the citation. Not why? Because Bill doesn't go around bragging about this stuff, okay? It was his truth-telling before Ed Snowden decided to get out that persuaded, among other things, Ed to do what he did. Man, so we're always learning new things. And you know, when people are self-effacing and don't toot their own horn like I do, then it's hard to, it's kind of hard to figure out what they're all about. So I just want to start that out that way. So without Bill Binney, there would have been no Ed Snowden. And without Bill Binney, there would be no veteran intelligence professionals for Sanity memorandum of the 24th of July, which said, was the Russian hack an inside job? Okay. Now the memo, I won't leave you in suspense. The memo answers that, okay? And Bill has already explained how we reasoned to that and how, you know, it's so neat to have positive evidence from forensics. Forensics that for some weird reason, the FBI didn't think it necessary to do. Yeah, right, that's right. You know, John McCain and others are running around saying, this is an act of war by Russia, and it's an act of war. And James Comey is sort of sitting back and he's saying, whoa, wow, yeah. But CrowdStrike, which is this disreputable cyber outfit that the DNC hired, they were the only ones to tell the story. And the story, of course, was what the DNC wanted people to hear. So what now? Well, the important thing here is that this common wisdom that Russia hacked or meddled or interfered or, you know, basically what they're telling the American people is, you wouldn't have that clown in the White House if it weren't for Vladimir Putin. That's bad. That's a real blame game, okay? Now, most Americans are convinced that that's the case. Just as before Iraq, most Americans, 69%, thought that Saddam Hussein had something to do, played a role in 9/11. It was a masterful propaganda coup. That's what Americans thought. Not only that, but they thought that weapons of mass destruction existed there. Now, you have Bush and Cheney saying, oh, you know, if we have anything to regret from our 8 years, it's the mistaken intelligence on Iraq. Well, folks, I hope you know this was not mistaken. This was out and out fraud. And it pains me to say that because these are guys I know. These are women and men that I know, people who used to be working in the fields that I plowed for those 27 years. That's what we have now. No one was held accountable for that. And so you have the same careerists, the same hand-picked analysts doing the same kind of persuasive to persuasive to the media. The media is in on this, of course, and that's the situation we have now. So if I forget to say this, I'll never forgive myself. In 55 years in Washington, I've seen a lot of change. You know, you have to be blind not to see a lot of change in 55 years, right? But there's one change that dwarfs all the other changes in significance, and that is that we no longer have a real free media in any real sense of the term, and that could not be bigger, folks. The fourth estate is dead. If we didn't have computers, if we didn't have the fifth estate in the ether, I don't know how it works, but it comes down to my computer, and I can find out what's really going on. And most Americans don't realize where to look or how to do that. So when we say that this is really kind of a real crucible here, and people like Bill and others are marginalized, you know, here's an interesting thing. We have Господин Dolgi from the Russian consulate here, okay? Now, you probably have already reviewed the wonderful Sunday program that Maria Zakharova was on last Sunday. Did you see Воскресенье вечер? You did, okay. Now, she, of course, pardon?
I'm not from the consulate. I'm from the mission to the UN.
Oh, from the mission to the UN, okay. Well, if you watch it to the end, you'll see that veteran intelligence professionals for Sanity got two whole minutes of those 30 or so that were given to this program. She's talking about the indignities that the consulate in San Francisco suffered when it was forced to close. And they're really sort of angry about all that, right? And then she says, not only that, but these veteran intelligence professionals who have no access to grind, they have no contacts with us, they found out that it wasn't a hack by Russia or anybody else, that it was a thumb drive. She goes into wonderful detail. She's read our memo. You know, I'm saying, whoa, Maria Zakharova is saying this to the prime TV Sunday show. It's called Воскресенье вечер, and the guy is Solovyov. He's the most prestigious interviewer. So what am I saying? Well, what's her main point? She says, they've said all that, they've got it, they're heavily experienced, and guess what? No U.S. media will touch the story. Wow. You know, now for 27 years or almost, I had to read Soviet media. I mean, it was before we got Presidency, you know, on the wire. And the propaganda, well, was sort of outrageous in some respects, but you could read it and you could understand what was going on. I've had a kind of, well, the word is metanoia, okay? You got to take your mind, your nous, and swim it around and think about, wow, now it's Zakharova exposing the kind of propaganda that our folks are being exposed to every day, whether they think they get the news from the evening or get the New York Times and so forth. And I give you some examples of that, but it was really quite amazing. And the coup de grace was this, that the sucker who made this available to me early this morning, that's why I'm a little bleary-eyed, pointed out that immediately after he translated what Maria Zakharova was saying, YouTube promptly deleted this video. So, I mean, hello? So we can't even see what the spokesperson for the Foreign Ministry of Russia says, because she included this stuff about us. I guess we should be proud of that. Anyway, we must be really, important here, you know? Yeah, sure.
When I was working at NSA, I always gauged how successful I was by how many people were shooting at me. Okay, so that's a case.
Well, they're shooting at us big time. I have to tell you, our article gave rise to a wonderful article in The Nation magazine, a liberal publication, right? And to her credit, the publisher of The Nation not only commissioned this article, but let it be published, and found out she was facing an insurrection, a rebellion in her staff. Why? These are all Hillary people. Hillary couldn't have possibly lost because she was a lousy candidate. I mean, nobody trusted her. It had to be the Russians, right? It had to be the Russians. How can you destroy our narrative? And so, there's a tale right there. This is a liberal magazine. So we're up against it. And what I'm about to tell you will probably put me really up against it, because I'm going to tell you how I put the dots together. Okay. Now, I'm an all source analyst. That's what we say. I have access to satellite photography, intercepted communications, the whole schmear. I also have to read memoirs. Like, I'll have to read Hillary's book now. My God. I mean, some of this is, I had to read Bush's memoir, and I learned a lot because he actually wrote some of it himself. God. So we have to follow the press as well, right? So what happens? In March, all of a sudden, Julian Assange of WikiLeaks makes an announcement, and he says, a leaker, a contractor for the CIA, has given us a vault of documents that is more important and more inclusive than what Ed Snowden leaked from Hong Kong. Whoa. First two stories, part 1 and part 2 of this so-called Vault 7. The first one, as I recall, it said, we have cyber tools that we've developed, we CIA. This is CIA documents, guys, okay? This is not made up. And nobody disputes the authenticity of these documents, okay? So we can take control of a car by this computer and make it go 110 miles an hour. Oh, that's neat, Next one, we can monitor what goes on in the bedroom through a Sanyo TV that everybody thinks is off, but we hear everything that's going on there, right? Wow, that's great. Then, on the 31st of March, this year, I'm waking up because I usually watch Amy Goodman, and it's about 7:15, and I get a phone call, and it's RT, not CBS or ABC or it's RT. And usually they call me about 11. So I said, what's going on? They said, we have a release from WikiLeaks that really is really damaging and really interesting. And you need to come in, if you can, right away. Now, I live about 10 miles out of Washington, D.C. But I said, well, you have to send me the link, see what it is. And I read the link. I said, my God, yeah, I'll come in. And I said, what time do you need me? He said, 9 o'clock. I said, you're not even open at 9 o'clock. He said, well, you have the Eurovision. You go to Eurovision. So I get on the carpool lane, right? Devotion to the truth here puts you in a carport lane all alone, risking pretty heavy fines. So I'm driving in there, and I said, what am I going to say, So I call this fellow Binney, I said, Bill, what am I going to say about this program that allows, that is a cyber tool the CIA has developed to allow it to hack into emails and other computers and disguise who hacked in and actually plant little telltale signs in like Cyrillic, or Russian, or Chinese, or Arabic, Farsi, or Chinese, or Korean. Those were the 5 languages that working on. I said, my God, what do I say about this, Bill? And Bill says, in his normally dispassionate way, look, Ray, I know about this program. We were working on it with the CIA for a long time. It goes back at least 15, 20 years. Ray, this is what you say. It involves 700 million lines of code. So McGovern says, oh, that sounds like a lot, Bill. Is that a lot? And Bill said, yeah, that's a lot, Ray. Look, can you do mathematics? I said, yeah. Each line of code costs $25, Ray. Do the math, okay? We're talking billions of dollars, right? Now, who has that kind of billions of dollars? Well, $1 trillion spent on intelligence folks. It's our money, folks. So they've got these cyber tools. And I go in and I talk to RT, and I had two other interviews that day. And then over the next week, I had maybe 5 or 6 more putting out the word. And guess what? Nobody took any notice. Nobody took any notice at all. They say, well, RT, it's kind of, you can't depend on RT. So it was one of these things where you could put these dots together. Now, I don't like the word put dots together, but it didn't take a rocket scientist or a brain surgeon or even a crackerjack intelligence analyst to say, hacking, Russians hacking, but maybe not Russians hacking, maybe cyber tools that the CIA is using to make believe the Russians hacking. Oh, wow, could that be, Am I the only person that put those dots together? I don't think so. But so far as I know, I'm the only person to write about it, to talk about it, the only person that I would encourage you guys to think about, because I think therein lies the answer. Cy Hirsch, when he was taped not inadvertently, but he didn't know he was being taped. He blamed he says that John Brennan is a expletive deleted, and you're quite right. And is he capable of all this? Of course, he hacked into the Senate computers, remember? And then he denied it. And then he said, oh, yeah, I did it, yeah. And what did Obama say? Oh, well, don't do that anymore, please, I mean, so you want to talk about the deep state or the fear that people have of the deep state. And we're talking the 3 agencies that were supposed to have been the drafters of this embarrassment to the intelligence profession, this memo that came out on the 6th of January, NSA, CIA, and FBI. Before they said 17. And then Clapper, for the first time in his life, told the truth. He said, no, it wasn't 17, it was 3. And it wasn't 3, it was handpicked analysts in 3. Now, we know what that means in the intelligence profession. If under Bill Casey and Ronald Reagan, you wanted to prove that the Russians, that the Soviets tried to kill the Pope, well, you go to the people who are experts in that and they don't give you the right answer, then you go to hand-picked analysts. And guess what? Their careers zoom because they come up with the right answer, and that's the answer you send down to the White House, and that's what the White House distributes to the press. So it's pretty bad when you have hand-picked analysts. And I don't know what got into Clapper's mind. Clapper was the director of national intelligence. I mean, didn't he know that most people would realize what it means, and you handpick the analysts, you handpick the result, and you get the analyst. So it really was pretty bad. Now, I want to give you an example of one of the cooperators in all this. Good guy, real nice fella. He used to work at the Pentagon. His name is Jay Johnson. And he's a lawyer, and now he's head of the Department of Homeland Security. If you see something, say something, right? Okay, now, here's Jay Johnson. He's asked by Leslie Stahl, hey, you had to approve the killing of people by drones, including American citizens. And you said, says Leslie, at one point you said, you didn't know it was okay to kill an American. Lucky. Johnson, well, occasionally I would have to conclude that the legal authority wasn't there. This is a quote. And I quickly found out that, well, it was easier to say yes than it was to say no. Stahl. Why was it easier to say yes? Johnson. Well, to say no, these are all quotes, folks. To say no is like stepping in front of a 90-car freight train. Stahl. Now, the first time you said yes, you have said that you were very uncomfortable. Johnson. How could somebody be comfortable authorizing the use of lethal force? Now, the use of lethal force means killing somebody, okay? So how could somebody be comfortable with killing somebody, okay? Leslie Stahl, well, what you actually said that time was, quote, if I were a Catholic, I would have to go to confession, end quote. Jay Johnson, yes. Subconsciously, my God, I'm glad I'm not a Catholic. I'm like, hello? His wife is a Catholic. That's why he knows this stuff, all right? So that's the kind of mentality that gets you up to be head of Homeland Security. If you see something, say something. We've all seen Jay Johnson in action here. Now, he put out a memo on this subject, this hacking, on the 29th of December. Now, he's a lawyer, right? And he wants to be real careful. So he had a notice, right? And some of you know this. He had an advisory, a truth in advertising, fair warning thing. And it said, we publish this as is. We don't really vouch for its authenticity. We publish it as is. Well, hello. God, that's the kind of stuff you get in the bureaucracy in Washington. So just to kind of sum up, what we have here, as Bill has explained, as I have tried to, is a deep state, a John Brennan who, with his lackey Mikey Morell, clearly wanted Hillary Clinton to win, and in my view, cooperated in creating the impression that the Russians hacked into the election, the Russians meddled, the Russians interfered, and it was all done out of not thin air, but with cyber tools that cost, well, that involved 700 million lines of code. Now I know what I know what that is. I know what it costs. Okay, so that's the kind of stuff we're dealing with. And I just add that earlier this year, on the 3rd of January, and I don't watch Rachel Maddow, but I saw what happened there. She had on this fellow named Chuck Schumer. I think he comes from around here. I don't know how much brief for him, but this is what Chuck said. And bear in mind, Chuck knows the Jay Johnsons in the world. He knows the CIA guys. He's been around a long time, Chuck has, right? Okay. So this is what Chuck says. Trump is really dumb to do this. What's this? This is taking on the intelligence. He's being really dumb. Let me tell you, this is a direct quote. Let me tell you, Rachel, you take on the intelligence community, they have 6 ways from Sunday to get back at you. So even for a practical, supposedly hard-nosed businessman, Trump is being really dumb to do this. Now, Rachel, of course, rose to the occasion and said, Senator Schumer, are you suggesting that the President of the United States is afraid of the CIA? Right. What she said was, let's go to break. Let's go to break. I mean, hello? Here's the senator, ranking Democrat in the Senate now, saying, look, Trump's really taken on too much here because the intelligence community has 6 ways from Sunday to get back at you. Very, very foolish. I thought he was smarter than that. This is Schumer. This is the situation. So just to sum up, folks, they are really afraid of this. And I can give you scads of stories about how Obama was afraid of all this. And so I just end with a supreme irony. Now, I'd just like to sort of pause and let this sink in. I've come to the conclusion that there was gross interference in the U.S. electoral process, but the culprits were Hillary Clinton and the functionaries of the Democratic National Committee who stole the election from Bernie Sanders and put us in the situation we're in today. Sorry about that, folks. I think Bill wants to say something.
Could I just add one thing here? I wanted to reflect on some of the things that Ray said about the three intelligence agencies, FBI, CIA, and NSA, who are the ones doing this. Well, if you remember, maybe you don't, with the impeachment of Richard Nixon, it came out that CIA, NSA, and FBI were the ones involved in the spying on U.S. citizens, and that meant the COINTEL program at FBI, and CIA's Chaos program, and NSA's Minaret program. So then my co-conspirator whistleblower from NSA, Kirk Wiebe, and I decided, well, we look back and see when was it that the United States wasn't spying on U.S. citizens? It turns out that only we found evidence of the Shamrock program from World War II to 1973, 75, somewhere in that range. And with those programs that under Nixon, and of course the current programs with Stellar Wind and all that, we found that probably from their existence, they were only about 40% of the time they were not spying on U.S. citizens. Otherwise, all the rest of the time they were. It's all unconstitutional. That's why we're challenging it in court. We want these guys to be brought out and exposed for what they're doing.
So before we go to our question and answer period, and thank you, Ray, for your remarks. Let me just recognize a few people in the audience. Barbara Honecker, former White House policy analyst and special assistant to the assistant of the president, author of October Surprise, for those of you who remember or go back that far, as I do. Richard Gage, the founder and CEO of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. And most people here understand what that is. And then William Jacoby, who is the National Action Group's project leader for A&E for 9/11 Truth, and also Mr. Les Jameson. Yeah, everybody here knows Les. I want to thank you. I'm going to thank them for their work. So as people are going to the microphone, let me just say a couple things about EIR and in terms of what you can do. We have a couple of other of books here, and I want to say why. I'm going to take a minute here. There's a method called universal history. It was actually developed by the poet Friedrich Schiller, who was a professional historian. We followed that method for a long time. As you know, there have been some interesting matters concerning American history. One of them is that the American Revolution was actually the most successful, most important anti-slavery fight in world history. That's important for those of you who've been following Charlottesville. This book, How the Nation Was Won, America's Untold Story, was written by now deceased historian Graham Lowry, and will tell you the story about this. This goes from 1630 to 1754. Those who are interested and want to know, pick it up. The second book, The Civil War and the American System, was written by my former best friend. He's now deceased, died 25 years ago. His name is Alan Salisbury, former member and, or rather, a fellow traveler of the Black Panther Party, who discovered or rediscovered what is called the American system, what was referred to by Mr. Wertz earlier, and the economic advisors to Lincoln that created the design that we've discussed here. No one knows about this person. No one understands, or not no one, we do, and now you do, that this is the actual real history of the United States. And so I'm encouraging people to think about the overthrown axioms. Maybe many of you came in already favorable to what you've heard, particularly Bill and Ray go through. I don't think anybody came in really knowing what Will was going to say, because that's actually relatively new. It's been discussed at some times before. So as we go into questions here, I just want to encourage people, first of all, visit the literature table and pick these up. Ramsey Clark used to refer to us as the book people. You may remember that term from Fahrenheit 451, the people that decided to make themselves books. They memorized books, and that was the way that the memory of the civilization was carried on. That's who we are. And so we very much welcome your support. Finally, people should subscribe to our publication. That's EIR. You get this online. This is the latest issue. And you can see any of our people outside or here about that. Okay, so let me stop there and we'll go to our first question and people can just line up here. Go ahead.
I actually have two questions. One is for the gentleman of their will.
Identify yourself.
My name is Lynn. So, as far as back as in late 1800s in China, after China was beaten by by Great Britain in the Second Opium War, I think Lincoln sent as ambassador a man by the name of Burlingame, and then later, let's say Wharton Barker, to help with the development of railway in China. And I know for a fact that the great Dr. Sun Yat-sen in 1907, and then later wrote the International Development China, which was the roadmap for developing China, developing the economic and industrial capability of China. So all the railway, all the waterway, everything that China is now today doing are blueprint from Dr. Sun, and essentially, it seems to me, from Lincoln. So can you comment on the future of potential collaboration between China and United States and this collaboration around infrastructural development? And then I had a second question actually for Binney, for Bill, because I saw the documentary and it was incredible. And I wanted to ask a question about Thin Thread and actually how you came to develop it, and then how you actually, I think you, and then it was supposed to be given $1.3 billion, and then suddenly it got pulled and ended up being Trailblazer that was given the money, and then General Hayden, who became the head of the NSA, and his vice, I guess, deputy, who Black, who then ended up putting the money to their former company. So I just want to know more about that. Thanks.
Yeah, what you developed is precisely the case. For instance, the entire plan of Hanato was to make sure that and Avita was to make sure that the Trans-Siberian Railroad actually went through Manchuria. And the basic idea was to free China from the British. Because of course you had two opium wars in the 1800s, prior to this whole period. You also had a brief war between the French and the Chinese in the Vietnam area. So Sun Yat-sen is another reflection of exactly how the American system after Lincoln was actually spread in terms of the ideas throughout really Europe, Russia, China, and other locations. The irony is that China has actually been engaged in precisely what Franklin Roosevelt was committed to develop the world through American system methods, like the Tennessee Valley Authority or the Grand Coulee Dam, the locks in the St. Lawrence Seaway, or the Boulder Dam. These are the four corners policy of Franklin Roosevelt. He wanted to spread this throughout the world. And that was based upon Alexander Hamilton, the policies of, and Graham Lowry's book discusses this, that the British did not want the United States to move west to develop the continent as a whole. And this was the perspective of the founding fathers, to move west. And eventually this was consolidated with the Transcontinental Railroad of Lincoln. So the basic point here is that as Lyndon LaRouche said the other day, we're on victory is within reach. Because we do have some adults who are creative in leadership positions in the world today, which has not always been the case. We are really, in putting forward the American system, it's in opposition to the policy of British system of free trade, of opium wars, of slavery and of genocide, which they've carried out throughout the entire world. And every nation we're talking about has had to free itself from this British system. And they've had to resort to American system methods. And that is what we're on the verge of doing right now, thanks in large part to Lyndon LaRouche and Helga LaRouche. And there was a recent article in the China Daily, which featured an interview with Helga Zepp LaRouche. And you know, she reported about how she had gone to China back really in the 1970s during the Cultural Revolution and saw the devastation that existed there. And then she returned later, much later, with the perspective of the Silk Road. And there's an appreciation in China of the role that the LaRouches, particularly Helga in terms of China, has played. And as I went through in the beginning, you see what Lyndon LaRouche has done from really from the 1970s. He wasn't just concerned about the United States. He functioned, as Schiller said, as a citizen of his own country, but also as a patriot of the world, or citizen of the world. And he was developing programs for development for the entire world in the spirit of what Franklin Roosevelt told Winston Churchill that America was going to do, as opposed to what the British Empire wanted to do. And that's where we are today. And I would just say that's, as I stressed, this is what's at stake right now. And it's really up to, in this country, the American people, but obviously throughout the world, for people to really understand this, that you've got to rise to the level of grand strategy, of a grand design for the world, for humanity as a whole. And you've got to actually approach it from that standpoint. Yes, fight for your own people, but but you also have to fight for humanity as a whole, and it has to be based upon truth and the question of justice. And you know, I think that's really the issue, and we've got to mobilize to make sure that this actually succeeds at this moment.
My turn? Okay, all right. First to the Thin Thread program. I mean, your question was, how did we come up with it? Well, you're facing a problem of figuring out what's going on in the world. And when you're faced with this massive stuff, you have to try to figure out how to get your mind around it, to figure out how you can solve it and select. Actually, the problem, I characterize it as making the content problem a manageable problem. Because if you collect everything in the world, you just have gazillion terabytes of stuff, and you can't figure out what you've got. There's just too much of it. So how can you figure a way of boiling it down? Now, the classic case, and they're still doing this anyway, it's one of the reasons they're failing, is because they're doing dictionary selecting or word searching, much like Google does. And that's how they prepare selected outputs from the database to push at analysts, okay? So when you do that, I mean, you go through everything. I mean, they're copying it. So if you use the word bomb, for example, to say the quarterback threw a bomb in the game to end it, to win it. And your little bomb picks up, that word gets selected, and you get, just like Google, it gets pushed at you. Well, that's how you fail, because then you have to weed through it to find out what's important. You may not be on the first page of a Google output where the item you want, it might be on the 100,000th page, but you never get there. So that's the reason they fail. But anyway, so how could you do that? Well, the whole idea was to reverse the entire way you do analysis of data. It's a new paradigm of looking at big data. It's looking at it from the attributes that are describing things that could be associated in the data, not the data itself, but the connectors of the data, how you can organize data to connect back and forth, like, for example, social networks. People calling other people, people emailing other people, or financial transactions, account to account kind of things, those kinds of relationships that you could build, then using that to see, well, this is a bad community of people in a social network. I want to see what they're doing. That gives you the entire capacity to pull everything out through all the massive flow of data in the world. Those attributes are why the only data you pull. The rest of it, you just let it go by. And so that really became the theme of how we had designed the new paradigm. We did it in a meritocracy way, like things that win and things that we do are based on merit, not opinion, not agenda, not, oh, we have a contract here, we need to continue to keep it going, If it made no sense, we didn't do it. So you just have to sit there and say, what's the best way to do this job? And then once you say, okay, this looks like the best, anybody got anything else to say? And you hash it around and you come up and say, well, no, we don't have any better ideas. Let's do this and see how it works. And if we need to adjust it, we'll look at that and then maybe adjust. So you do it all on the basis of merit of the effort. Is it worthwhile doing or not? And you pay attention to nothing else. No suspicions, no emotion, no agendas, nothing. That's the way you do the job, and that's the way you get it done. That's why we could do it for 3.2 million, because we focused really on how do you do it, and ignore everything else.
And the price tag for the substitute.
Well, the initial cut was 3.8 billion. After that, it went up double, triple.
You don't know what.
Trailblazer, which is the next thing, which was the SAIC, and the people came in. For example, Bill Black was hired in 2000, I think, and came in 2000. He was the former chief of A Group in NSA. He retired and became a senior vice president of SAIC, scientific something or other. I can't remember. You can look it up on the web, SAIC, and you can get it as a contractor. They worked for NSA. So he was a vice president there, and Hayden, who came in 1999, hired him on as the deputy director. And he later, in 2001, since some of the programs weren't working too well, according to him anyway, Hayden created the Trailblazer program. That was his program that failed miserably after 5 years of executing it, X billion, It produced a lot of very colorful, pretty PowerPoints. Okay. It actually functionally did absolutely nothing. We had all the stuff they took that they could claim is working. They took from Thin Thread, the program we did for $3.2 million, and that's the one that Thin Thread basically did the design of filtering out everything that wasn't relevant. So everybody had privacy. We didn't have the data in a base, and we encrypted any attributes that they had until we could prove they were part of a conspiracy or part of the community's activity, terrorism, whatever it was. And so even inside NSA, they couldn't tell who they were looking at because it was all encrypted. So you couldn't say, I'm looking for X star pound sign, 123, whatever, because that has no meaning in terms of who is it? Well, you don't know. So that was, and we did that to force them to get a warrant. Internally, we wanted to force the issue of getting a warrant. Once we started that execution, none of the data anywhere in the NSA system had anybody's identifying factors. They were all encrypted. From the point of intake, we would encrypt. Okay, so that gave them protections that way too. Then, of course, we had another one that did monitoring who came into the network, like CIA and FBI, who have direct access into the NSA databases through programs IC Reach. You can look it on the web, Google it, you'll see their access points that way. But even before that, Mueller, in his article with the Time magazine, I can't remember who it was. I can't remember the name of the interviewer, but he said in there, we've been using the Stellar Wind program, the FBI, since 2001. Well, the Stellar Wind program is the taps and take of the Fairview program and other programs of all the content of data in U.S. citizens. Phone calls, audio, as well as transcripts, emails, file transfers, chatter, all the stuff you're doing on the web is recorded. That's why after the Boston bombing, one of the former FBI guys came on and said in CNN, I think it was, that they have a way of getting back to the phone calls and what the wife of what Tsarnaev brothers said before the attack. They have a way of getting back. Well, it's the recordings that NSA made. Okay, so all of that stuff that's what they've been using, and in order to make these programs work, they removed all those factors from our Thin Thread program and used all that software to do that. And so instead of filtering up front, they just let it all come in. So because we designed the first fiber optic rate sessionizer we had running in early 1998. So we had it running and could collect, at that time, it was only a matter of how much space power you had to be able to collect everything in the world. And that was as of 1998. And so, but other than that, to make it further, to run all these transition programs, the transformation programs for NSA, they brought in another former vice president of SAIC, Sam Visner, who came in to run those programs. Well, surprise, surprise, the first contracts coming out on this Trailblazer program went to SAIC.
How much money?
Well, the initial cut was like almost $300 million. But, you know, it kept going and getting bigger. So, but, you know, what's wrong with this picture? You know, there's something wrong with this picture. Okay. But the FBI doesn't want to know about it. Yeah, go ahead.
That volume. Okay, just before we go to the next question, we have a short statement from State Senator Richard Black. I think some of you know about him. It won't be video. We're just going to do a short reading. That way we can save time. Also, Diane will do it from her seat. Diane Sarah's LaRouche Policy Committee member. Hold on, we're giving you a little.
Hold on, I can just go up there. Now you can hear me? Okay, good. So he writes, to Mr. William Binney, Mr. Ray McGovern, and other conference participants at the EIR September 9th conference in New York City, the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, VIPS, has presented evidence to President Trump that Russia never hacked the Democratic National Committee. The VIP's review of the matter strongly raises the likelihood that the emails in question were leaked by an insider, not hacked, and were subsequently altered to attribute responsibility to Russia. I am in agreement that a new special prosecutor should be appointed to investigate those responsible for perpetrating the possible hoax, which has so damaged and divided our entire nation. I urge President Trump to act on your suggestion, and I support your steadfast efforts to bring the truth to light. Signed, Richard H. Black, Senator, Virginia, 13th District.
Right. Okay, next question.
Hi, my name is Jose Vega. I'm from New York. One of my many interests in this world is to remind people that they can think for themselves. They don't need a media outlet to tell them what to think. I'm in the business of teaching people how to think. So it pains me, not as just an educator, but as a human being, when I see other Americans hoodwinked by things like Russiagate. And I know I wasn't around for a lot of the other things that happened, like the Iran-Contra deal. At least I wasn't conscious back then. And when you try and you think about this and you say, why have Americans been hoodwinked so many times? Why are they so distracted? How are they able to be distracted so easily? You know, when you look at just New York City alone, you have a failing infrastructure, a subway system that is overcrowded and overpacked. I believe the number is that they have 110% people in the subway carts. It's overloaded. People can't even breathe in there. You have roads that people can't even drive on anymore, and yet people care about how many scoops of ice cream Trump gets every day. So the essential question here is, how do we ensure that this is the last time a Russiagate happens? So that people can now, instead of talking about themselves or worrying about what their president eats, they can worry about fixing their own country, fixing their own state, ensuring that people can get to work on time, ensuring that people can be educated, the real issues. So that's my question.
Okay. Anybody want to? So who of our three would like to answer?
Go ahead.
Well, I just say that I see the media as the fly in the ointment here. And I think our inability to break into the media, you know, somebody once said that the fault is not in our stars, but in ourselves. Are we not imaginative enough? Are we not courageous enough to figure it out? And we get brain power in this room that just won't quit. So I'm in favor of what I call the NOAA principle. No more awards for predicting rain, awards only for building arcs. We've got to figure out how to build some arcs here and force our way into the consciousness of our fellow Americans.
I would just like to add that here's the proof of -1 times -1 is 1. Okay, it's real simple, but he's an educator. We had this math talk before we came here, so I thought, well, you know, it's important to know. I mean, how can you multiply negative times a negative, get a positive? Well, there you go. Okay, so but at any rate, I think thinking is really the joy of life to me. And that's, I guess, the perspective I have. But if we can get that instilled into people, that thinking is more a form of living. If you start thinking, you're really living, you know, and that's really the key to me. I think, to get people to think. I mean, it's most people are thinking is the hardest thing they have to do, right? When it's not really, it's the fun part of life, you know, really, in my view, anyway.
I think the American poet Edgar Allan Poe addressed the issue most directly in a short story called Malanta Torta, because what he said there is that the oligarchy is able to control a population to the extent to which it is convinced that there are only two pathways to truth: empiricism and logical deduction. And if you look at all of the things that we've been confronted with over the recent period, that's precisely the way in which people have been brainwashed. They look at what the empirical evidence which they've been fed by the media, by so-called authorities, and they operate from the standpoint of certain logical deductive axioms, and they're trapped in this situation. What Poe basically said, that this is the empiricist method is the Baconian method, which he was referring to Francis Bacon, and the logical deductive method is that of Aristotle, is the person he referred to. And but to be human, he said, is not to creep or crawl as you would from the standpoint of empiricism or logical deduction, but rather to soar and to use the method of hypothesis, which is the method of Plato, of creative thinking. And he said this method is the method of Kepler. And that is the real critical issue. People have to understand how to think. And if you think that the only way that you come to knowledge is through empiricism or logical deduction, then you're controlled by the oligarchy. And this is a fundamental principle, I think, that people have to actually understand. But I think we have reason to be optimistic, because in a certain sense, the world has a very clear alternative in terms of a new paradigm. And the extent to which I mean, you see people responding, for instance, in the face of these hurricanes, in a manner which is similar to that of the Good Samaritan. I mean, what makes us human, just to reflect on what you were saying, is a passion for the truth, a commitment to humanity. It's what the Greeks called agape, or love, and it's that quality that is evident in the situation in many sections of the world today. You look at the win-win strategy that was put forward by the Chinese. This is the strategy that ended 30 years war in Europe in the 1600s. The concept from the Treaty of Westphalia to act on the basis of the benefit of the other, as opposed to egoism. And I think this is also what the poet Shelley referred to in his defense of poetry. It's a kind of mass strike phenomenon where, which is not an economic strike or a general strike. It's a mental process in which people rise above their parochial interests and think about humanity as a whole. And what we require right now is to really elevate the kind of good works that you see in people risking their lives to save other people. In the case of Texas, or what we saw with the first responders at 9/11. We have to actually rise to the level of what do we need to do for humanity right now? Think in those terms, which is to think big in terms of what the mission of man is. And I think if we do that, then we have the potential for bringing about a very fundamental change right now. President Trump could take certain action right now. The Russia gate is blown out of the water by the evidence that has been presented here today. He should seize the moment, not just to raise the debt ceiling, but rather to move with his promises during and after the election, and to work with China and Russia, and to eliminate the danger of thermonuclear war. Join in the fight against terrorism, which the Russians have advocated repeatedly. That's the direction in which we have to go. That will actually bring about a complete shift in the world as we know it.
Thank you.
Okay, can you lower for Barbara there?
Hi, can you hear me? All right, I'm Barbara Honegger. I was a senior White House policy analyst and for 16 years, the senior military affairs journalist for DOD's premier science, technology, and national security affairs graduate research university, the Naval Postgraduate School, as well as a high-ranking Justice Department official. And the people up there are my friends. We've known each other for a long time. So my first comment, I'm with you 100%, and I've been with you and DIR and the LaRouche organization ever since the chief domestic policy advisor to President Reagan in the West Wing of the White House told me on day one, the most dangerous man in the world is Lyndon LaRouche. And from what we've heard today, I think he was right about that. Okay. The first thing I'd like to do is to make it a win-win. If you haven't already, I don't believe you have. I believe that the letter to the president that you have written, VIPS letter, needs to be read into the congressional record by a member of Congress on both the floor of the House and the Senate. So make that a goal. In the spirit of truth, I would like to, this is for Ray McGovern, my friend of 30 years, colleague from our Iran-Contra October surprise days. Are you aware, Ray, and everyone here, that whereas it is technically true that there was no Iraqi WMD, if WMD is narrowly defined as nuclear weapons, nevertheless, there is absolute proof that there were massive quantities of biological weapons, in particular VX nerve gas weapons and nuclear triggers with Carlyle Corporation bills of lading. And the whistleblower on that, whose case is currently before the United States Supreme Court, is Francis Gregory Ford, known as Greg Ford. Please go to YouTube, see my interview with him. It's actually audio, but it's on YouTube. The title is Iraqi WMD and Torture Bombshell. It will blow your mind. There were Iraqi WMD. And it's not a coincidence that right after that interview of mine, it's only 27 minutes, everyone can watch it while you're having a sandwich for lunch. That interview, right after it went up on YouTube, believe it or not, the former head of the CIA, Mr. Woolsey, went on, I believe it was PBS, but he went on national television and said, hey, wait a minute, there was WMD in Iraq and it was biological weapons. So biological weapons are, WMD is nuclear, biological, and chemical. I just wanted to go on the record with that. And my question is for Mr. Binney. Now this is in the spirit of your success, all right? I'm with you 1,000%. That the United States and Russia need to be friends. That's the bottom line of the transformation of geopolitics. But my question from the devil's advocate point of view, because our enemies will want you to be able to answer it. Whereas it is obvious that you have essentially very credibly proven that there was no download from the DNC, no hack from the DNC with the data going over the Atlantic to Russia. But how do you rule out, perhaps you have, could you tell us, how would you rule out, or have you already, that there could have been a download from the DNC to the Russian embassy a few blocks away? Thank you.
Well, you see, that gets back to my original basic understanding of how the NSA taps into the fiber lines. The embassy in the US is watched like a hawk. All their phone calls, everything going in and out of that embassy is picked up, just like WikiLeaks. Everything that happens with WikiLeaks, Julian Assange in the embassy, or any of his affiliates in WikiLeaks, all of that's being monitored, cast iron by either GCHQ or us, NSA. If that's,
That would be known.
yeah, my
Yeah.
point is if they have the data, tell us, show it.
Prove it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, Bruce Todd from New Jersey. Recently, I had published in the local newspaper in New Jersey, a fairly big one in New Jersey, my reading of the memorandum. And at the end of it, I called for people to act as citizen soldiers to make sure we don't have regime change in the United States, which is really what we're talking about here. I also was able to get on a talk show sponsored by my local congressman, where I was able to ask him the question of, after going through some of the material, how do you help in the Congress to get Bill Binney and Ray McGovern before the Senate and the House Intelligence Committees to give testimony, which should be the question for everybody in this country.
Can I add
And I'll
something?
leave
here?
that to
Let me add something here. You know, I testified to the Bundestag in Germany, the German parliament, the committee investigating the B&D, NSA equivalent. And when I was there testifying, you know, right in the middle after I started, the chairman of the committee had to welcome representatives from the United States government to come in and listen to my testimony. I said, well, you know, I'm only 20 miles up the road. Why don't you give me a call? I'll come down. Well, you see, the reason they don't want to hear from me is they know, because I didn't take any material with me when I left NSA because I invented most of it. So you know, I don't have a problem, and Congress knew that, okay? It's not that they didn't know, they knew that. So if I went to testify to them, they could no longer claim plausible deniability. And that's really what their whole issue is. They want to be able to not be accountable for anything they've done. That's the problem.
Okay, great.
Hi, good afternoon. My name's Tina Tillman, and I'm from Stuart, Florida. Glad to be up here with my fellow New Yorkers, transplanters, and the LaRouche people. Thank you so much, sirs, for all of you being here. It's an honor to be in this room with all of you, Americans and patriots. My question is, what do we as American people have to do for people like you to be heard? And this is directed to all of you, because you all have been so persecuted for your beliefs and your truths. And I think, as being a patriot, an American, and a seeker of truth and understanding, now more so than ever, that our country is under attack, which for some time I was quite asleep until I met the LaRouche group back in 2011, have by opening my mind and reading more and not being so closed off, which our system tends to do or has done educationally, professionally. My question is, being an activist and one who is wanting to be a truth giver for the American people, what would you suggest that, you know, what we can do to make this all come to light for the betterment of our country, but not just for our country, but for mankind, because this is a humanity issue. Thank you.
I can tell you the kinds of things I'm doing. I would recommend bitching and moaning to your representatives and senators. Just to say, if you don't stop this crap, I'm going to work against you, I'm going to donate money against you. I'm going to fire you any way I can. But they listen to that, The other thing I would advocate is the thing that I'm also doing, is sue the bastards. I've got 4 lawsuits in the circuit courts, the 2nd, 3rd, 9th, and 11th Circuit Courts of Appeal that I'm supporting, suing the government for constitutional violations of the privacy rights and Fourth Amendment, First Amendment rights, and the Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights under the Constitution of the rights of citizens of the United States. They're violating all of those. They violate the First Amendment because you have the right to free association. Not today, you don't. They know everybody you're associated with and everything you're doing with them. And you also have the right to privacy under the Fourth Amendment in your papers. You don't now because they're taking them all in. And in the case of the FBI, they look at them to see if they're finding criminal activity. If they know from a tip on the street that you're a potential criminal, they'll go in that data and look, see what you're doing with no oversight whatsoever. And then they'll violate your Fifth Amendment because that's violation of what you're saying without a warrant. And then they'll use it against you in a court of law, violation of the Sixth Amendment due process, So, and what they do is they perjure themselves. Once they get evidence from this intrusion, unconstitutional, unwarranted intrusion, they go arrest the people. And this is local and state police doing it. They tell them what to do and where to go. This was published by Reuters in, I think, August of 2013. And it basically said they do this, and then in order to, this is from the Department of not alcohol, firearms, but Drug Enforcement Administration. They gave the slides that showed how you use the NSA data to arrest people. And the do's and don'ts, you never tell the courts, you never tell the lawyers either side that this is what basis for your arrest. You never document it in affidavits of any sort, so there's no record of using it. And then you, in order to make it work in a court of law, you do a parallel construction. What that means is you go use standard policing techniques to go find the evidence, which you already know where it is. So that makes it easy, So you go get that and you say, we got this through these standard police techniques, and that's why we arrested them. You substituted for the NSA data in the court of law. That's called perjury. So I call it, and they've been doing this to thousands of people in the United States for criminal time, standard crimes inside the United States. So I call this a planned program perjury policy run by the Department of Justice of the United States. They're committing crimes all over the place. Once you start that, the problem is it's fundamental to people, I think. Once you give people power, sooner or later, they're going to use it. I guess it's a fundamental flaw in humanity. But that's what we have in Washington, D.C., a fundamental flaw in humanity. And how to correct it is bitch and moan, gripe and groan, and sue the bastards.
I just want to add here, I agree completely with Bill. You may not know that Bob Mueller is a crook. And so is James Comey. And if you have any doubt about that, read what FBI Special Counsel and FBI Special Agent Colleen Rowley has written about both of them. Now, Colleen Rowley, as some of you know, blew the whistle on 9/11 and the terrible performance of FBI before 9/11. She had access to the New York Times pages until she started writing about Comey and Mueller. And for some reason or other, they turned down her most recent op-eds, but which are on consortiumnews.com. I'll get to the point here. There was a big meeting at Georgetown University of spooks, of CIA and other types, and they all came into this ornate conference room. And John Brennan was the impresario, and he had Bob Mueller, who had just retired from being the head of the FBI, to kind of lead off the remarks. And so he gave some little remarks, and he said, "Any questions?" And always the skunk at the picnic, and I raised my hand. "Yes, sir. No." I said, "Mr. Mueller, do you have any legal qualms about what is called parallel construction where you collect information illegally and give it to law enforcement and then have them parallelly construct a thing that they can defend in court, committing perjury with respect to the defense counsel, with respect to the judge. You know, do you have any legal qualms about that? And all these spooks going, it wasn't really a good question. And so Mueller looks at me, you know, he's a pretty tall guy, and he says, no qualms at all. After 9/11, we were given special authorities. So that's Bob Mueller. And just to finish this off, why did James Comey leak that information about what the president is alleged to have told him? Well, we don't have to analyze that. James Comey told us he wanted a special prosecutor nominated and put in place as soon as possible. What happened the next day? A special counsel was nominated and put in place. And who was that? James Comey's best buddy, Bob Mueller. So you've got the quintessential, the personification of the kind of deep state corruption running this investigation. And, you know, are they going to listen to us? Well, only if we rise up and make them. And once we do that, then Bill and I are in real jeopardy, because if we disappear, please check in on us. Okay, thanks.
I wanted to add one thing here to Bob Mueller. Under Bob Mueller, you know, the FBI, and under Comey at the time in the DOJ, the DOJ concocted basically false evidence against us, NSA whistleblowers, to try to convict us of conspiracy to expose classified facts, not further defined. What they didn't know was that I knew these people as criminals, so I knew I had to invest, and I had to watch and compile evidence against them, which is what I did. So that when our lawyers called us and told us that they were going to indict us in late almost December of 2009, our lawyers said to us, they're going to indict you and under the charge of conspiring to expose classified information. So I said, okay, thanks very much, and I hung up with them. But then I said, okay, I've got all this evidence in front of me that's saying I know they're doing malicious prosecution. I've got the hard evidence for it. So I said, how can I convey to them that I'm going to charge them with that when they do this? And so this is a story. I don't know if you've heard it before, but I've told it several times. So I decided to call Tom Drake. Why? Because I knew his phone was tapped. The FBI is listening to his tap. This is how I'm pulling the strings of these idiots, okay? And so I say, okay, Tom, our lawyer said they're going to indict us here, and here's the charge they're going to throw. And here, by the way, Tom, all the evidence I've compiled to show malicious prosecution on the part of the Department of Justice. And I started reading it across the phone to him. Tom, I guess, understood what was going on, so he never said a word. But in the end, I said, so tell your lawyer that I'm going to charge him with it when we go to court. Goodbye, Tom. And I said nothing more and just waited. It's a waiting game. So a month later, I know our lawyer never understood what happened because I never told him, because it wasn't, he just didn't understand this crap. Okay. So I was sitting there waiting, and then all of a sudden he calls me and he says, they're offering you and Kirk Wiebe letters of immunity. This is unsolicited. He was just told we were going to be charged. Now he's told we're getting letters of immunity. So he never understood what was happening. So I thought, well, I'd at least give some objection to that. So I said, you tell those sons of bitches to go piss up a rope. That's exactly what I told him. And he said, no, you can't do that. You have to consider that once you do this, it'll all be over with, and you can then go on and all that. I said, okay. Because it also gave me the chance to look these people right in the eye, which is also what I did. So when I went to talk to them, I was the prosecutor was sitting right across from me, Walsh. And then we had somebody from the FBI, woman, some special agent. And another guy who said he was from FBI, but he was from really Q2 and NSA, internal security at NSA. So I knew this, So I said, I wanted to start off the meeting properly. I said, you people don't know how pissed off at you I really am for all the violation of the constitutional rights of everybody in the United States. And this idiot on the end from Q2, that's how I know he's from Q2. He said, what violations are those? I said, well, let's start with the pen register law, the Electronic Privacy Act, Electronic Security Act, all the laws governing FCC regulations covering communications of U.S. citizens, the First, Fourth, and Fifth and Sixth Amendments to the Constitution. Isn't that enough? And they absolutely said nothing to me. Nothing. They had nothing to say. The only thing that idiot could do from Q2 was look at the prosecutor. I was waiting for him to say something because I knew him too. He was the guy who tried to falsify the senator from Alaska, give false evidence against him too. So, I mean, he was all part of this manufactured evidence program that NSA, CIA, and FBI and the DOJ have together. So, I just wanted to face, I thought, well, I reconsidered. I wanted to face these idiots and assholes, and I wanted to hit them with it. So I did.
Quick question, Bill. Did they really think you were guilty of anything? Did they really suspect you of having done something illegal?
No, of course not. I mean, there was no point to that. I mean, they didn't want me telling the truth to the Congress of the United States, any committee, that they were violating the Constitution and tell them how they're doing it. They didn't want the criminal activity of NSA and CIA and FBI together being exposed. That's the problem. They still don't. In fact, when I put all this documentation in the Third Circuit Court of Appeals in an affidavit saying, here's what they're doing, they're trying still to deny it and get the dismissal of that lawsuit in the Third Circuit. But I don't think they're going to make it. I mean, I put it out as an affidavit. I'm liable for that. So, I'm ready to testify.
I have a couple of things to say for people here. One, that we have approximately another hour, maybe a little bit more than that, for questions and responses. We may be able to go slightly beyond. But secondly, I have something else specifically here to say. 30 years ago, Bob Mueller prosecuted Lyndon LaRouche in Boston. Also, William Weld, who was later governor of Massachusetts and a recent candidate in a recent election in 2016. And also somebody by the name of John Markham. And the reason that prosecution in Boston didn't work is because someone by the name of Lawrence Welsh, the late Lawrence Welsh, the independent counsel in Iran-Contra, sent us a document for our defense. And that document came from the safe of Oliver North. And that document recorded that North and a man by the name of Lieutenant General Richard Secord, who ran something called the Enterprise, had colluded together to monitor and to surveil Lyndon LaRouche. And the document said, our man here has information on LaRouche. Let's see how polygraph goes. It also referenced certain airstrips in Texas, which referred to things that later appeared in other discussions around what some people have called the great crack cocaine matter. Telling you this because the reason you should subscribe to this, the reason is if you'd like to know what's been going on, this is the place to go. One of the things that people often said, and you heard what Barbara said about why we're so dangerous, it's called thinking. If you know how to change your axioms at will, then you're ahead of the game, including ahead of the so-called establishment. We refer to it here as deep state. Well, we talk about it as the shallow empire, the shallow, mentally shallow, okay, empire. We call it British Empire, but it's an extended, globally extended thing. That's just the way we do it. We like it because it upsets people. That's why we say it. So I just wanted to interpolate that. You should subscribe to the magazine. There's various things that are being worked out by my wife and others for all of you out there. There are books and other things, but take it seriously. You see, because intelligence is not information. This is an intelligence meeting. This is not an information meeting. You have a powerful weapon because you take this and you think you will change the country. And there's enough people here to do it today. So let's go now to the next question.
Oh, can I just add one thing here?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Let me. Let me just add one thing here. On the Iran-Contra deal and all that stuff, because the Congress wouldn't vote in money to buy guns and weapons for the Contras down in Honduras and that area. Why he set up that program, the cocaine program that you're talking about, actually run by CIA. The program names were called Amadeus, Pegasus, and Watchtower. You can go on the web and Google them and read all about it. It's all on the web, just CIA, Watchtower, CIA, you know, Amadeus, CIA, whatever, you know, and you'll get them. And you read about how the CIA imported cocaine from South America in so they could sell it on the streets of the US, get money and use that money to buy guns for the Contras so that it wasn't invisible to Congress. And the CIA was running that, your old organization.
Great.
Fred Lent, Yonkers, New York. What would be some telltale signs or specific policy measures that tell those of us on Main Street that President Trump is bucking the British Empire and the deep state?
Well, I mean, I would say the fact that they're attacking him, exposing his conversations, the NSA, giving away his conversation to other presidents around the world, and trying to discredit him and his administration. The fact that he's being attacked by them is evidence that he's doing something that they don't like and they're afraid of him. I mean, that's the way I look at that.
I would just add one thing since Mr. Wertz is not here.
Can I just
Go ahead.
add one thing? I was referring to measures on his behalf, on his part, that he would take that would tell us that he's
Yes.
bucking the
So,
system.
Just because Mr. Wertz isn't here, I'll just refer to something very simple. The speech that he gave in Kentucky, in which he referred to the American system. We'll then hear the question, so I'll just take it. That is, no American president has talked about the American system. Since it probably McKinley, maybe FDR might have talked about it. It is not a rhetorical reference. It references several specific economic figures: Matthew Carey, Henry Carey, Friedrich List, Erasmus Passion Smith, and 2 or 3 others. But that's who we're talking about. William Kelly from Philadelphia. These are almost unknown to the American people. When you reference that, this has been buried in history. These were Lincoln's economic advisors. He, that is the president, spoke about them. I don't know how much he knows about them. I don't know whether he read them or where he got it. I know he spoke about it. And that's a policy outlook. And it's the policy outlook that is what we see right now in China and Russia. They're using American ideas, but they're also not saying that explicitly. So if the president works with them, this conception now arises in the world. And that's the thing that's the most ironic of all, that Russia and China are right now carrying the virus of the American system. And it may be that the present president of the United States is intelligent enough to recognize it.
Thank you.
I'd like to add something in terms of what can be done. The Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity Memorandum of 24 July was our most consequential. We've done a lot of good work. This was number 50. This one could conceivably be turned into action by you all, okay? Now, one thing is to read it again and see that we asked the president to do certain specific things. We expose what we think is going on, and we won't retract one word of it. Right, Bill? Okay. We expose what's going on, and then we say to the president, for example, you may wish to ask CIA Director Mike Pompeo what he knows about all this hacking. Our own lengthy intelligence community experience suggests that it is possible that neither former CIA Director John Brennan nor the cyber warriors who worked for him have been completely candid with the new director regarding how this all went down. So there's a specific thing. Why doesn't the president call in Pompeo and say, hey, I smell a rat here. Show me the evidence. And the other thing we say here is, Mr. President, we don't know if CIA's Marble framework, that's the ability to hack in and obfuscate who hacked in and leave telltale signs like Cyrillic Russian. And we don't know if CIA's Marble framework or tools like it played some kind of role in the campaign to blame Russia for hacking the DNC. And we don't know whether the denizens of CIA's Directorate for Digital Innovation, what they've told you and what they've told Director Pompeo, quote, "These are areas that might profit from early White House review," period, end quote. Hello, well, that's about as easy a way as we could say, you know, you're the president. You're the president, okay? Now, are you going to confirm what Senator Schumer says? And that you'd be really silly to take on the intelligence community? Well, you wouldn't be alone. That's what Obama did. But if you're the person that a lot of people voted for, well, you have an alternative here. It's risky, but you ought to try it. Face them down, tell them to do it.
I mean, I think that that's absolutely the point. The president has the authority. He has constitutional authority to investigate this and to get answers as the VIPS has demanded. He also is the person with the authority to move forward with Glass-Steagall right now. And this, at one point, there were elements in Great Britain who argued that Glass-Steagall would be a casus belli to implement that. He has the power to actually work with Russia in the fight against terrorism. He has the power to say the United States is going to join the Silk Road. The point here, and look at the situation the country is faced with. We've got Harvey, and 1 million people displaced by this. This is not over in terms of the damage done there. We have Irma, which is going to hit Florida within 24 hours. It's already done incredible destruction in the Caribbean. And the point here is the United States is really in a situation of emergency. Emergency action is required. The president at this moment should get out of the box which he's been forced into since he came into office, and he should really lay down the gauntlet. These Democrats who just met with him in respect to the debt ceiling and a certain amount of a few $1 billion for relief in Texas, these Democrats and also Republicans have to be forced to embrace an economic program which is in the interest of the American people as a whole right now. This is a constitutional issue. The Constitution says, provide for the common defense. These wars, how do they add to the common defense? They actually weaken the security of the nation, what has gone on for the last 16 years. And Obama was as bad, if not worse, than George Bush with his drone killings, with his surveillance, and it's his buddies. The guy who sat in the Oval Office on Tuesdays with him, John Brennan. And Obama acted like Caligula. Thumbs down, kill him. That's what Obama did. He's a murderer. What happened to Gaddafi? So the point here is this president has the power to move in the interests of the nation. The Constitution says promote the general welfare. That is what needs to be done. And the American people will respond. That's why I mentioned before that we're in a mass strike situation. If the president gives direction, he has the power to do that. He has the power to end this fraud that's been carried out in terms of a so-called Russian hack and everything associated with it. He has the power to move with the economic programs that right now, no delay, that will turn the tables on the entire situation in this country. And that's what he needs to do.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. My name is Alvin. I had the opportunity via Skype or whatever it is, a couple of, in the recent period to talk to you. And I asked you both at the time, what was from your departments of expertise to describe the historic relevance of the British Empire's influence in your fields. And I'd like to keep that question open for you, but I'd like to direct that to Mr. Wertz, to Will Wertz on this. Your departments, your fields have been corrupted from the top down, and things work from the top down. Mr. LaRouche in the EIR has documented tons of data, information, and intelligence on that role, that historic role that continues today, that becomes more dangerous because their system is on the verge of collapse. My question to you, Will, is since we're irresponsible, I think, when we're talking to people to leave that out, and that's easily left out. It's convenient, but that's the top. And if we want to get things to work, that is what has to change. So what is the problem that we're confronted with, that the average citizen's confronted with, even intelligent people that seem to have this problem? And you say, well, actually, this is all British-led, British instigated, from the murder of from Burr murdering Hamilton right on through the presidents. How do we break through that?
I'm sorry, go first.
I was going to set the stage for the intelligence cooperation between the two countries because it's very close. In fact, it's the closest relationship of any intelligence in the world. It basically, it's called the Five Eyes, but it started in World War II when they were working, and the British were primarily looking at the Enigma and against the Germans, and we were looking at JN-25 and the purple codes for the Japanese. And when we got together, we started working both equally and in very close cooperation. So, and that fundamentally set the stage for the Five Eyes cooperative effort. And initially in the 50s and 60s, the British were always looked at as senior partner because they've been around a lot longer and been doing this spying business for a lot longer than we have. So they looked at them as the way of the experienced ones. So we kind of followed them and, you know, paid more attention to what they were and gave more credibility to what they were saying. But, you know, about 1971 or 2, somewhere in there, I started to say, well, this is crazy. They don't, in many cases, know what they're doing, you know. So I thought, well, you know, I had to branch out on my own. So that's when I did that. So, but at any rate, that whole cooperation started back in World War II, and it's very close. I mean, the most sacred secrets we were sharing and working together. So, and that really was a very productive relationship. It still is in many ways, but it also is a dangerous one because you kind of depend on one another too much, you know, and you kind of take things for granted that you shouldn't, that you should challenge. So I think it's like anything. There's a good side and a bad side to it. Or like I used to say with technology, if you're on the sharp point of technology out there in front, it's also the bleeding edge because you get attacked. So that's my.
Yeah, good. The British, what you had going into World War II is that there were elements in Britain who encouraged Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco. And particularly they wanted the Nazis to move to the east against the Soviet Union. But Hitler decided to strike to the west before engaging in the eastward thrust. And Churchill realized that Britain alone could not defeat Hitler. So he wanted to bring the United States into this fight. Roosevelt certainly was opposed to fascism. And so you had set up in the United States from 39 through 44, British intelligence covert operations operating out of the Rockefeller Center. This involved Sir William Stevenson. It also involved Allen Dulles. There were obviously there were American patriots who were involved in this, but you had others like Allen Dulles and Angleton, who were of a different nature and who after the war were involved in the Nazi rat lines, for instance, including Stepan Bandera and his top aide, who were both brought to in the case of Bandera, he was brought to London. His top aide was brought to the United States, and they were being used then against the Soviet Union, But what we see in Ukraine today is that the United States supported an unconstitutional coup using fascist Nazis who celebrate Bandera, who committed genocide against Poles and against Jews, working with the Nazis. So that's the kind of situation you've got. Now, what Mr. Binney was referring to is this UK-USA agreement in 1946, which came out of that. But the problem is, what was the environment after World War II, after Roosevelt died? You had Truman as president. You had Winston Churchill, who launched the so-called, the Cold War. And this was, this is the kind of situation which the British, in a certain sense, would like to create once again right now. And some people in U.S. intelligence circles actually refer to the reported the British attitude after World War II, which was the U.S. is a dumb giant on a British leash. They used the power of the United States for their own purposes. Now, obviously, there were elements in the United States, certainly in the tradition of Roosevelt, who had a completely different view, including in the intelligence community. Many of those same people were involved in working with Lyndon LaRouche before Reagan became president. And I mean, some of them were still in intelligence agencies, others were retired at that point, but they were from that Roosevelt tradition. And the basic point here is that you have to look at this from the standpoint of policy, what the British policy actually is. And you look at the royal family, and they're not insignificant. The British press had pictures of Queen Elizabeth as a child giving Nazi salutes. Her consort, Prince Philip, half of his relatives were members of the SS in Germany. Now, beyond that, what you have is a situation where Prince Philip has said explicitly that if he were to die, he'd like to, and if he were reincarnated, he would like to come back as a virus in order to kill off billions of people. The policy of the British Empire is to reduce the world's population from over 6 billion to 1 billion. That is their policy, or less than a billion. That's why they're in the forefront of the policy of zero growth. That's why they encouraged the book Limits to Growth back in the, I guess it was either the 60s or early 70s. And which was based on a false premise. The argument was, we have limited resources, therefore we have to stop industrialization. What does that mean for the third world? What does that perspective mean in terms of how the United States itself was deindustrialized under outsourcing? This is a genocidal policy. And it's based, as I said, on a false premise, because there are no limits to growth. If you redefine the mode of production, you redefine the resources. If your mode of energy production is wood, well, sure, you're going to either use up the wood, or it's going to become more expensive to use because you're going to have to go further away and transport it to produce energy. But we developed coal, and after coal, we developed fission power. But the British don't like fission power. They want to prevent nuclear energy. So the United States hasn't produced a new nuclear power plant in how long? Decades. And yet the Russians, the Chinese are building nuclear power plants all over the world because it's a higher form of energy production which redefines the energy base. No longer do you need wood or coal, you use uranium. And then the fourth point of Lyndon LaRouche's 4 laws is to develop fusion power, which is derived from deuterium or helium-3, which is found on the moon, which is much more efficient. So this redefines the situation altogether. It's like the person who says, oh, well, We don't have any water, and yet in California, and yet you're surrounded by the Pacific Ocean. Why can't you have nuclear desalinization? What prevents you from doing that? Well, the British are in principle opposed to that policy. Look at the effects of colonization in Africa, genocide. And what are the Chinese doing? They're developing Africa. They're doing not for any material purpose, but rather as an act in behalf of humanity. Why are the Chinese now investing $4.7 billion to rebuild Haiti, which we didn't do after the hurricane? This is the British policy. So the problem here is that you've got a situation which defines the intelligence agencies are a reflection of these underlying policies. That's what defines what answers are being asked of intelligence agencies to questions, the prefixing of answers, right? I mean, the select group of analysts who are going to give you the answer that Dick Cheney wants, or that is Comey and Clapper and Brennan want in terms of the so-called Russian hacking. So that's the way you have to actually look at this kind of situation, that it comes from the standpoint of the axiomatic assumptions, of policy assumptions on the part of the British Empire, what they're actually putting forward. And you have to also look at the very close relationship between the British royal family and Saudi Arabia from the standpoint of 9/11. Particularly look into Prince Charles and his relationship to Saudi Arabia. So it's these kinds of questions which really are fundamental in terms of intelligence, because we should have an intelligence service, and the best people in it are committed to this, as these gentlemen have just said, who are truth seekers and realize the consequences of coming up with false assessments to the world, to humanity. That's the issue that's before us right now. And we, as citizens of this country, have to insist upon this. The Constitution, the preamble of the Constitution starts out with "we the people." Sun Yat-sen adopted Lincoln's statement from the Gettysburg Address, of, for, and by the people. That was his theme. That is the concept that we have to operate on. It's up to us to insist upon the policies required.
And let me just make one announcement, and then you'll go to this question. Right after this question, I've got 3 questions that have come in by email, which I'm going to read, because otherwise those people will never get their chance. I'm going to ask when we get to that, only one person from the group here answer those, so then we can make sure we can keep focused here. We're going to keep moving here as best we can. So, okay, that's my announcement. Go ahead, sir.
Hello. Is this on? Test, test. Can you hear me? I'm a little deaf, sorry. My name's Ken Simmons. I'm an actor, filmmaker, Marine, 9/11 rescue worker. 9/11's been degraded, put on the back shelf. If you tell somebody you're from there, you're put down. America's been put down. My country's been put down. My people been put down. My system been put down. Listening to this conversation, I've been invited to LaRouche for years. Spoken with several people on the phone, but never have came. And my question is, if we don't have a way to get your voice out there, everything I heard was great, but no one hears it. I hear it in this room, but we don't hear it. We don't have a politician on our side. We have a president on our side, but we don't have a single politician on our side. All of them crooked, all of them lining their pockets. How does a guy go from making $400,000 a year to living in a $7 million home and own 3 of them if he's only making $400 grand a year, and half of that's supposed to be going to taxes? So how do you expect to get your voice out there when you don't have a way to get your voice out there? Facebook is blocking every single conservative site, every single patriot, every single patriotic American. Anybody that loves this country, that waves the flag, is a dirtbag, scumbag, low-life piece of boom. And I don't believe that. I can't see why I don't see people like this group in the streets. I don't see groups like this standing out in front of the View saying, you guys are liars, you're communists, you're traitors, you're backstabbers, you're pushing propaganda on the communist agenda. It's not socialism, it's communism. And it's hate for freedom, hate for rights, and hate for America. So how the hell are you people going to get your word out there if you don't? I created the site. It's called therise.com. It's a site as big as Facebook. It's taken me 8 years in development to make this site. The app is out at the Apple Store. On this Sunday, the app for the Droid will be out. Facebook has tried to hack my site over 9,000 times in the last 6 weeks alone. I am being hacked now. They're listening to me. I've actually been on my phone giving them the fucking finger saying you this, and they block all my sites right there in the spot.
We
So
get
my
it.
question again is, how are you going to get your word out there if you don't have a venue to it? You don't have no news.
Okay.
And I'm asking as a citizen, you have
Understand.
no news media. Paper, buy my magazine, buy a book. People don't
Right.
read books. People don't read paper.
Yeah.
So once again, and I love everything you stand for. I love everything everybody in here stands for.
Okay.
I love my country.
let
I'm sitting
me-
here. Well, let me finish. I'm sitting here riddled with cancer from 9/11. I've been fighting it for 7 years, been in the hospital. On the 18th of this month, they're going to remove my arm and remove my shoulder. But yet I stand up and I keep fighting for my country. And I'm under my dying breath. I made this site, The Rise, because I believe in God, I believe in Jesus Christ, and I believe in the American dream, and people come from all over this world. Black, white, gay, brown, I don't care what you are, fat, skinny, ugly, you're here, you're an American. I fucking love you, and I'll die for you. And I ran into those buildings downtown,
Okay.
and I got riddled
right.
with cancer, and I did that for us, and to
Okay.
have people humiliate us, dog us, put us down, but not see a group like this. I don't see you anywhere. I don't see you on the
Okay.
goddamn streets. I don't see you out
all
there
right, sir,
protesting
sir.
like I see liberal
It's all right.
communists.
Calm down for a minute.
So
That's true of all
I
of
just want to be able
us.
to say how. My answer and my question is how? How are you going to get out there? If
Okay,
Facebook
you
blocks
asked
you,
it.
if social
Let
media
him
blocks you, Yahoo
answer.
blocks you,
Let
Google
us
blocks
answer
you.
it. Let us answer, okay? Great. Anybody want to take?
I thank you, sir, I thank you for bringing us back to building arcs and not just predicting rain. I agree with you. I'll give you a little vignette. I was speaking at the Columbia School of Journalism, right? And we're talking about drone warfare, and we're talking about Westinghouse preparing some of the guidance packages for these Hellfire missiles. And somebody said, well, where does the CEO of Westinghouse live? Oh, he lives in Morristown, New Jersey, an hour away. Now, back during Vietnam, there would have been a bunch of young people immediately going to the back of the room, arranging for a bus to go to Morristown, New Jersey, to demonstrate in front of this guy's house, okay? This time, nothing. Nobody even thought of it. So, Martin King said, there is such a thing as too late. That's what I'm hearing here. There is such a thing as too late. And we're getting real close to that, folks. We've got all kinds of new laws that are unconstitutional but enforceable. And so if we don't get our rear ends off our seats and get out into the street and support this or that protest against injustice and against some of the things that are going on, last thing I'll say about this is Cesar Chavez, one of my heroes. Okay, he used to say to us, thanks a lot for your op-ed. Your speech was really great, but without action, nothing's going to happen. All right. Now you say, oh, there aren't enough of us, but there are enough of us. But without action, nothing's going to happen. So, you know what he did? We got to pattern ourselves after the people who don't just predict rain, but build arcs and get out there and put their bodies on the line. One last thought here. If you have hair the color of mine, you got a big advantage. You know why? Because I learned from getting beat up in front of Hillary Clinton that Americans don't like to see old folks beat up, okay? Now, young people, they got to come into them. What are you doing, But she got thousands and thousands of emails and telephone calls because of my friends in Veterans for Peace, just rallying people, say, hey, this is not tolerable. Now, if we at our advanced age are not willing to put our bodies on the line with this advantage, okay, that people care about what happens to us, what kind of model do we have for the young people? Will the young people think, well, maybe this is important because these old guys are putting their bodies on the line? I think they will. But to have that happen, we got to go ahead and do it, folks. So I agree with you.
But I don't think, that still doesn't answer how you're going to get your word out there. You don't have a.
All right, well, I'll answer it, okay? Okay, I'll answer it. But I'll answer it. I'll answer it. And I'm saying it that way because, yeah, you're here now, and that's good. In 1986, I was here. October 6, 1986, 400 federal, state, and local law enforcement persons armed with automatic weapons tried to kill Lyndon LaRouche. Kill him. Shut down our whole organization. 50 of his associates were prosecuted. Some of them turned against us. That was 31 years ago. We're still here. So the issue is, how do you survive being killed? Think. In other words, the idea is this. If you really intend to win, and you can win, you don't need a lot of people, especially scared people. What you need is a few people who are committed to doing whatever it takes to win. That you're in the right place for that. More we can talk about after our live webcast is down, but I'll just put it this way to you. The important point is that the people who are here today, many of them represent organizations, many of them have been doing things for many years. And many people who are listening all over the country and the world, because this is a live webcast. That's right, exactly. I know, yeah, you didn't know. I understand, no problem. So
How you doing?
It's significantly beyond the numbers in this room. And significantly around. And I'd also like to point out, I don't think it's a problem, not who, but there are several governments who are here in this room.
Really?
Yeah. So I think I'd ask you just to take your seat, not calm down, actually, but just know that we heard you.
Love. It's love.
I understand, but know that we heard you, and just want to get to the other people here. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
God bless.
I think he's awesome. We need people like this in America. I don't ever had, I would take it off for him. I was born in Afghanistan. My name is Reyes Nadi. I left Afghanistan in 1979 during the Russian invasion. And I was brought here very young. I escaped with my mother in a Russian military plane. Everybody was going down south in Pakistan. I didn't like religion that much. I was going to an American high school. I came from a very liberal family from Kabul. My dad was a principal of a built American high school in Afghanistan for 7,000 students. My mom was a nurse. She's very old now here. I have a question of the situation, what Afghanistan is right now, and with the US foreign policy over there, and the intelligence that was flipped over during the Mujahideen that became Taliban, supposedly committed 9/11, tomorrow's 9/11, and I'm very hurt about it. I'm also an architect. Another architect submitted a plan for ground zero. I was against any kind of high rise on the whole 16-acre site. I submitted a plan. They call it ground zero and zero. I said, you know what, how about a zero level? So I submitted a memorial park for the 3,000 Americans that got slaughtered that day through architecture and through political parties and religion, all that stuff that destroyed humanity on the planet. I erased boundaries in my heart, in my head. When I left Afghanistan, I became homeless. I'm still a homeless, but I made myself an architect. As an artist, I go on the streets of New York, I sell art. I get chased by police, I get attacked by dog, but
Please
all type of
understand what
stuff.
I'm about to say. We just have to hurry because we've got a lot of people and little
Okay,
time.
my question is that what will be the Trump administration's foreign policy for Afghanistan, with Afghanistan, because these puppet governments in Afghanistan, when they get in power, they put their own gangs and all that stuff in power and connect and steal the money, buy homes in Dubai and all these places. This has to end. This has to, my work has never been recognized, though I've shown in universities
so
in Washington.
that's your
and
question?
Submitted. What will be the foreign policy of this administration, the situation in Afghanistan? Because I have a pipeline of projects. I love to see it built over there.
Okay, anybody want to say anything?
The policy toward Afghanistan is a fool's errand. It goes back to Alexander the Great. You know why they call Alexander the Great great? Because when he tried to get to China through Afghanistan, there were these weird people that didn't like foreign invaders. And they took a lot of casualties on his flanks. And finally, he convened a council of war with his generals. And he says, you know, I don't know if this is a good idea. And look at those mountains between us and China. And he changed his mind. He said, let's go back to Asia Minor where we know what the hell we're doing. Okay. That's why Alexander the Great was great. Since then, we got the Persians, we got the Indians, we got the British, we got the French, we got the Americans. Come on, give me a break. I think Rudyard Kipling put it best. It is not wise for the Christian white to harass the Asian brown. For the Christian riles and the Asian smiles, and he weareth the Christian down. At the end of the fight lies a tombstone white with the name of the late deceased. And the epitaph drear, a fool lies here who tried to harass the East. It's a fool's errand, folks. We ought to all get up and make sure that Mad Dog Mattis and all those other generals that think they can do better than Alexander the Great and the French and the British and give me a break. If we can't win with 100,000 troops, how are we going to do it with 3,000 more? It's just really feeding the military-industrial complex. And if we can't see that, we're sort of blind. That's my view.
Additionally, I would just say the following. There is a solution to this. It's the Silk Road. It's the One Belt, One Road policy. And you have a number of nations adjacent to Afghanistan that could help in this. So instead of a military solution, what you need is a diplomatic solution. I don't think we can say what President Trump's policy will actually be, other than what we shape it to be. And the solution would be for Trump to approach, for instance, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which includes China, Russia, it includes Pakistan, includes India. And I know Iran is also a nation which would like to join it. I think it's an observer at this point. The point is you need to get a group of people, a group of nations that will work with Afghanistan forces to come to a diplomatic solution. The same kind of approach that's required in Korea. What the Chinese and the Russians have called for is a resumption of the six-party talks. That is what you need. For instance, again, what Putin proposed to and discuss with President Moon of Korea was economic projects involving North and South Korea and Russia. These are projects that were under discussion before, but were sabotaged in 2005 by the Bush-Cheney administration. And Obama continued with that policy. There are solutions to these problems. It's economic development and cooperation, especially among nations in the vicinity of these crisis points.
Okay, thanks. Let me make this announcement. Because of various issues, we have about 16 minutes left. I will take the next question. I'm going to read 3 questions from the internet. They are short for one of each of the speakers. If we don't get to your questions while we are live, you will be able to ask your question of the speaker when we're not. Okay, just so everybody knows what we're doing here. Okay, so go ahead. And please keep it concise if you can.
Yeah, my name is Roger Razak. I'm representing Pakistani American think tank. My question to all our panelists today. Now, through the question, we shifted to Afghanistan area. When I see the American history, I see the only war they have ever won was the war of Afghanistan when Soviet invaded Afghanistan. And Pakistan was the one who stepped in and fought on their own for 2 years. Then later on, United States back up with the money and the weapon to defeat Russia. At that time, they spent, I will say, a few $1 billion in all 10 years. Now they are stuck in Afghanistan for the last 16, 17 years, and they spend trillions of dollars, and the mess is getting worse and worse day by day. And all the fight, even in the late 70s, Pakistan was the one who was playing from the front. And even now, Pakistan is the country who's on the front line against this war in terror. But doing all that, still, like all the pressure, all the isolation is for the United States. And when we see the India was on the other side during the Soviet war. They were supporting Russian. And now when we took the front role in this war in terror, still the India is, like getting the main role in Afghanistan, which has not much role to play in that region better than Pakistan.
You have to summarize because.
So, why is that kind of policy when the country which contributed more, we faced $123 billion loss in all last 15, 16 years, and we lost more than 60,000 civilian lives and our security officers.
Okay,
So,
okay. Sure, please, go ahead.
Yeah, I think when you talk about lost money, it's not really misplaced or kind of people are getting it, the Cheney people, the contractors, the people who, the warlords are getting this money, okay? There's no, there is a check on what's going on in Pakistan, but every time that that official that's supposed to monitor the money looks into it, he says, this is crazy, it's being all siphoned away. Now, you mentioned India, and of course, this is the key to the whole question. We're never going to be able, nobody's going to be able to suppress the people in Afghanistan as long as the people and forces of Pakistan support them. And why do they support them? So that India won't regain predominant influence in Afghanistan. It's very, very simple. We try to tell people, we try to tell Obama, look, this is the problem. You're never going to stop the Pakistanis from causing trouble in Afghanistan because their whole way of looking at things is to make sure the Indians don't get predominant influence there. That's the name of the game. Colin Powell Condoleezza Rice, they openly said, we're going to change. We're going to change the way the Pakistanis look at Afghanistan. Now, nothing could be more naive. You're not going to change that. And as long as you don't change that, they're going to keep supporting the Taliban and the others. And so it's a fool's errand, as I said before, but India plays a very crucial role because that's what the Pakistanis are afraid of.
Okay, I have to now do what I have to do here, and I'm going to give you an example of what I mean. I am stopwatching myself, so you all know that. I've got 3 questions I've got to answer. I will simply say in response to what the gentleman said, that's perfect for a discussion off the microphone afterwards because it's a long discussion involving Mountbatten. It involves the British. It involves 1947. It involves earlier things than that. And it involves the BCCI operation and Clark Clifford and the assassination of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and several other things, which you cannot walk past because the truth of the matter is that Pakistan became a patsy in a war, which was no more than an extension of the Great Game. Now, I just did that in 40 seconds. Now, what I want done, okay, is what I want done is this. I'm going to read off these 3 questions from the internet people because like they just aren't here because they couldn't be here. I just want, and then we will go to your question, sir. It's likely that's going to exhaust our period of time. And then what we will do is allow people to come and speak with the speakers or whatever and address your questions. So I'm going to do this as rapidly as possible. And I will say this, okay? So the first question is from Amber in Florida. What is the split within the VIPS organization about regarding your memo to President Trump? So that will be, of course, one of the 2 gentlemen to my right. Then there is a second question from someone named, I don't know where he's from. He's named Jim. I won't say who, last name. He would like to ask Binney, what's the story with the CIA whistleblower Kevin Shipp? Is he also in the VIPS? His videos on CIA. I don't know much more about that. And then finally, a question from Bruce from Vermont, if I can get it here. And if I can't, I'm going to let it go. Give me a minute. And that was, this is also directed to Mr. Binney. I think you've actually referenced this already. In Oliver Stone's documentary, meaning Code, produced by Oliver Stone, about you, the Good American, you mentioned that the program you developed, Thin Thread, had the capability to stop the 9/11 attacks, but that the Thin Thread program was shut down under the orders of NSA Chief Michael Hayden prior to 9/11, and that it was then privatized. Then Could you elaborate and comment upon this? You've done this already, I think, but I'll also go through it. As it seems as though the capabilities to prevent this tragedy were directly sabotaged prior to the event, and in the necessary fact-finding efforts afterwards. Truth on this matter is very relevant here on the anniversary of that event. Okay, so that was what that question was. Those are the 3 questions. So
I'd like to quickly answer the third one.
Sure.
What my view was, very simply put, he basically said it. They traded the security of the people of the United States for money. And they did that by, see, Thin Thread was an automated process that automatically executed things. It was like how you put together algorithms that capture the knowledge of people, how to execute things, how to figure things out. And then you do it electronically. So it happens in milliseconds. So, and there is no central point of failure. It's distributed. So every time it does something, it distributes the output. So that kind of like when it would say, okay, these guys are coming in for Kuala Lumpur, they're terrorists and these are their names and they're going to land at San Diego and this is the time the flight they're coming in. That you would say when the manifest hit the country, which is before the plane takes off in Kuala Lumpur. That's the kind of processing we were talking about. So that this would automatically alert not just NSA people or CIA, but also FBI, State Department, everybody. So and no one could control that output, okay? And that was automatically executed. That's the one thing they didn't want happening. They wanted to control things too. So I said, and I accused them all of it. They all traded the security of the people of the United States and everybody in the free world for money.
Dissension,
dissension in the VIPS, yeah.
You want to do that? Yeah. You're the VIPS guy.
We in veteran intelligence professionals for Sanity are a movement We're not an organization. Get this, we don't even have a website. But if you look on consortiumnews.com, links to all our memos, all 50 of them, can easily be clicked on, and you can see what our record is. We're very proud of our record. We have a procedure where we allow, in this case, the most recent one, number 50, 2 weeks to prepare a draft and get it coordinated to the degree people want to sign on. This is an unusually long period of time. We usually do it in 3 days, but this one was pretty complicated, and we were relying on independent investigators that we really didn't know all that well, except by their works. You know, people would say, "Well, how can you depend on people you don't know?" Well, Binney says, we look at what they do, what they say, what they found out. That's what we look at. Yeah, the evidence produced. So suffice it to say that we had folks that didn't want to sign on, and we said, well, okay, you don't want to sign on? We have enough people. We have Binney, we have Kurt Wiebe, we have Ed Loomis. These are 2 of them are technical directors from CIA retired. Okay, that's enough. Okay, so we went ahead with the memo. Otherwise, it takes forever. We wanted to publish it before Congress voted for this draconian sanctions against Russia and Iran and Korea. We want to make sure that somebody spoke out and said, this is really stupid because it's based on a false premise, okay? Now, if you do that after the vote, I mean, you might as well just not do it. We're not academe, you know? We don't do these things to make them pretty and nice. So we were actually kind of pained that some of our colleagues chose to, after the fact, sort of raise all kinds of dubious objections, which I called lacking in merit, but Bill called much more accurately not based on fact, right? See, this guy's based on fact. It's kind of a real bear for people who want to base on, you know, pettifoggery or you know, sort of, what about this? What about that? And Bill usually says, well, what factual basis do you have to? I mean, he's a real, he's a hard nut to crack. So
Actually, they called me, they said I was unreasonable. I said, well, you mean you're unreasonable if you expect to have some fact to make an assertion? Okay. So at any rate, the only thing we heard before the publication of that thing was that, well, we didn't sign on because we have reservations. Okay, what are they? Well, they had 2 weeks to tell us and they didn't.
Okay, so I'm just going to make some announcements before our final question and then the responses. Just want people to know that there is a concert that's being done by the Schiller Institute New York City Chorus. That's at 7 o'clock tonight. An evening of sacred songs and spirituals from Bach to Burley. It is a commemoration of 9/11, and you can find out more about that at the table. The chorus is made up of our members. Many of them are here, and Diane, who's sitting there, is the choral director, among other things. Secondly, this is the petition that has been talked about a few times. President Trump investigates British subversion of the United States. Take a look at this. This is a particular action that is being urged by the LaRouche Political Action Committee. Finally, the fraud of Russiagate exposed. This is the VIPS memo. So if you did not get it when you came in, you can get it at the desk. And then finally, again, you should subscribe to the publication. I think it's obvious. You'll be seeing much of, if not all of, the transcript of today. And that's for people who are the book people and want written copies like this, or you'll get it online. And otherwise, you should visit our literature table. Okay, so we go to you. You're our final question.
Thank you. I'm Bill Jacoby with the 9/11 Truth Action Project. But my question is kind of on the margins of our group's activities. First, I want to thank you all for your work, and particularly to recognize how important it was that, or how great it would have been if Thin Thread was where our evolution of surveillance system stopped. So I totally grasp the magnitude of that work. But I wanted to ask, really calling on the depth of all of your experience in intelligence agencies. with the benefit of hindsight, looking back to before that time, while work on Thin Thread was either being conceived before, after, and during, in the light of what we know now, how real do you feel that the terrorism threat is or was to this country? I think particularly, but I want you can discard this as a factor in answering. So much research we read on the internet about the connections, intelligence community connections to everyone associated with the hijackings. Was the whole thing, could our terrorism fears in their totality have been avoided by different American policies which would have not jeopardized fundamental American interests? Or was it from its inception, the quest for surveillance to prevent terrorism kind of partway down the fool's errand that you've discovered and shared with us?
Well, first of all, if they'd adopted Thin Thread, it would have done the same thing for every terrorist attack since 9/11 and before 9/11. There wasn't any terrorist attack that wouldn't picked up beforehand. In fact, we knew the entire terrorist network before 9/11. We had Osama bin Laden's cell phone, Inmarsat phone number, and we were monitoring him, knew his whole network by 1996. So all that meant was, and this is on the web, you can go say Osama bin Laden's phone, Inmarsat phone number, and it's published. So you can go get the exact number. But the point is the Thin Thread program applied everywhere in the world. It didn't matter where in the world it was all the capacity to be able to pick that out and get warning before those events anywhere, like Brussels, Paris, all of that.
Reference that we read that bin Laden was on our payroll much earlier than that. So if you found somebody in our intelligence agency, they might have just been able to give it to you.
No, that's not the way it happened. But yeah. But we after 1993, when they had the first attack on the Trade Center here, we started really looking hard at them because he was turning after the Afghan war and the Russians left. And so, he was looking at us as the straight Satans after the 1991 war with Saddam. So he looked at us occupying the Holy Land as in, unclean people in the Holy Land and stuff like that. So he basically, I think, took that opportunity to turn his focus now on us. And so that's when we turned our focus on him. So, and that meant that we figured it was pretty clear, the entire worldwide network. And the reason we were safe, by the way, was not all this bulk collection. His people, former people, did a very focused, disciplined attack to take out every element of the Al-Qaeda network worldwide. And they did a very successful job by the fall of 2000, early winter 2002, they were gone. And it was by their program, not by collection. Everybody attributing all this is really valuable. That's horseshit, okay? They did the right job.
Well, the only thing I'll add to this really is, what motivates terrorists, How do you defeat terrorism? Well, you defeat terrorism the same way you defeat malaria. Let me explain. With malaria, you find the mosquitoes and you trace them back to where they breed, right? Okay. And you see that swamp, and then you station 3 platoons of sharpshooters around the swamp, and you try to hit the mosquitoes as they get out of the swamp, right? Wrong. What do? You drain the swamp, for God's sake, okay? Now, what swamp am I talking about metaphorically? The swamp of legitimate grievances that many of the people in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and everywhere in the Middle East especially have against us and against the British and against all the people who have exploited them in our name. Now, when John Brennan was asked that question by, what's her name, the wonderful correspondent at White House, she died about 3 years ago, Helen Thomas, yeah, she said, Mr. Brennan, tell us, what motivates these terrorists? And he said, well, Al-Qaeda, they want to obliterate the homeland, and they just hate us. And she said, yeah, but You never say why. Well, I just hate this. Is a religious thing. They don't. Well, she said, well, yeah, but why? He says, well, I just it's too complicated. I can't really. You know, give me a break. We know their grievances. We know where the swamps are, and as long as we start trying to shoot all the mosquitoes leaving the swamp, we're just going to multiply the problem X-wise.
Let me just add that the fundamental issue that you're dealing with here is the great game that was run by the British. Clearly, the United States or elements of the United States went along with this, and that obviously involves the question of Afghanistan and involves the question of the entire Middle East, a geopolitical game, and a failure to actually be involved in a policy of economic development. Which is this issue that Mr. McGovern was just raising. In other words, you've got young people. What makes them susceptible to this? Well, they're looking at no future, and they're very easily manipulated into a radical ideology. So but look at this the other way. Lyndon LaRouche in 1975, as I said, proposed an international development bank. He proposed a long-term development program for the Indian, this was the economic development of the Pacific and Indian Ocean Basin. This, for instance, this involves waterworks to capture the water when the ice in the Himalayas melts, capture the water from the monsoons and redirect it. This would affect that entire area. Again, I go back to the question of, if you look at Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, this is an entire area that was manipulated historically by the British. We know that. And as in the case with LaRouche's Oasis plan, this was a plan to get the Israelis and the Palestinians who don't trust each other to develop trust through joint economic development in their mutual interest. That is the kind of program that you need if you're ever going to solve the conflicts which the British left behind in the Indian subcontinent, as they have virtually everywhere else in the world. It was by design. It was a method of control, of imperial control. So the only way you break through that is through economic development, raising the educational level of young people, giving them a sense of a future which they have not had for centuries. That's the issue. That is the way in which you could stop. Or that's the way you really combat terrorism, whether it's the 9/11 terrorism or what have you. 9/11, you're talking about, this is basically 25 years after LaRouche proposed the International Development Bank, just as an example. So, if those kinds of programs had gone through, that would have been a significant factor in reducing the danger of terrorism.
Okay, so we're going to be concluding our event now, and I'd like you all to join me in thanking Bill Binney, Ray McGovern, and Will Wertz for their presentations today.